Hier hadden we met de 20 afgesproken. Op een zondagmorgen bij de ingang van het Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. Alwaar hun tentoonstelling van de schoonheid en de troost loopt. De motivatie om te komen was hoog. Maar wat zou er later op de dag, als de 20 rond de tafel werden gezet, gebeuren? Zou de koppeling van het algemene en het persoonlijke, waarmee niemand moeite had tijdens de individuele ontmoetingen, in de groep ook nog werken? Jane Goodall, de etologe, zou een uurtje later komen, maar de andere 19 werden verwacht rond 9:15. Als eerste kwam Karel Appel aan, de beeldend kunstenaar. Gevolgd door Rudy Fuchs, de museumdirecteur, en Dubravka Ugrasic, de schrijfster. En groupe kwamen Roger Scruton, de filosoof, daarachter John Coetzee, de schrijver, in het midden Elizabeth Loftus, de psychologe, en rechts Wolo Soyinka, de schrijver. Volgende groep. Tatjana Tolstaja, de schrijfster, rechts Rutger Kopland, de dichter. Martha Nussbaum, de filosofe, gaat nu de trap op. Rechts George Conrad, de schrijver, links Richard Rorty, de filosoof. Rechts Freeman Dyson, de natuurkundige, en hier vlakbij Gary Lynch, de hersenwetenschapper. Daar in de verte, in de grijze regenjas, gaat de trap op George Steiner, de cultuurfilosoof. Binnenkomst van Leon Lederman, de natuurkundige, George Steiner. Daarachter Tatjana Tolstaja, Rutger Kopland. En daar doemt op Catherine Bott, de sopraan. Gevolgd door Martha Nussbaum, de filosofe. En dan Germaine Greer, schrijfster. Gevolgd door Simon Schama, historicus. Daarachter Richard Rorty, de filosoof. En George Conrad, nogmaals, de schrijver.
Taking a plane that goes at 7:30 or so in the morning. We're going to Budapest. Are we in the morning?
No.
The only thing that was clear is they weren't paying for breakfast.
Yeah, that I found.
How is Miles doing? Have you seen him?
I'm seeing him tomorrow night. He's at home with
He's
us.
coming to our university next year, so...
I'm with him tomorrow night.
Oh, well, give him my love, yeah.
I certainly will. A great admirer of yours.
Oh, well, he's great.
It's the way of dressing is so different from last time.
What was last time? What was I wearing last time? My
Something-
PhD robes or
Yeah,
something.
but something Earth Motherish.
I never wear anything Earth
Right.
Motherish.
Well,
It'd be a bit hopeless for me to be an Earth Mother.
yeah. Have we? Do you know if Mrs. Ugresic is here?
How do you do?
Nice to meet you.
Already.
I saw the first film about an abstract expressionist was about you that I saw years ago.
A long time ago.
It was a wonderful film, though. Actually,
time
yes,
ago,
you are. Yes, in the '60s, I guess.
Yes,
was it?
right.
Yes, you were at work.
1960,
Yes, Carol was at work in full delirium of spectacular,
Wild painting.
spectacular painting. Yes,
Wild
yeah.
film movie, yes.
Absolutely, it was wonderful. It was really wonderful. Yeah.
Okay.
I think I saw the same film.
Did you?
Yes,
Oh, you remember
I
it?
remember it very well.
Yes. It was the definition of what you do when you're abstract expressionist, really. Yeah.
I have the same problem looking at myself.
Well,
I can't evaluate
culture,
it.
the high culture of our civilization.
But I thought it,
not in decline,
they did a very
it's
good
just
job
decline.
of cutting and splicing and making it sound sensible.
This horrible mass culture,
Dan
which is
who
now
else would care about all
being
of us?
forced on young people rather schools.
May I introduce you to the exhibition? Your own exhibition.
Yeah, oh,
But I'm anxious to see the whole collection. I wonder if there's
I
somebody
do work on our own. And I think it also makes it more...
You can see it's a kind of a 8-dimensional Rorschach test. It's apparatus. The larger the apparatus, the smaller the objects that you can see with it. And this is a fragment of some apparatus that took 300 or 400 people 8 years to build, so that we could study how the universe works in the micro scale. This is at Fermilab, which is the...
Are these lenses or?
Pardon me?
Are these with lenses or?
No, it's more complicated. The apparatus itself contains about 100,000 sensors of various kinds. Once upon a time, they were called Geiger counters, so they visualize the results of some huge collision.
I said it.
Oh, you said that? You think Victory Boogie Woogie is the best? No.
The 20th century?
Oh, you mean about the 20th century? Oh, but this is about the beginning of the 20th century. Victory Boogie Woogie is a kind
No,
of...
this is they're all fantastic.
Yeah, no, this is really about the farewell to the physical world. Victory Boogie Woogie is about...
1850.
No, it's a wonderful painting.
I swear it's like, you know, opening a curtain and a curtain again and a curtain again.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
But all Mondale paintings are like
yes,
that. Because
yes. I'd love to have seen the show when it was in The Hague, actually.
I have many photos of him.
So how old were you when he died?
He was 78.
And how old were you?
Well, it happened just a few years ago.
So you remember him?
No, absolutely.
Yeah, I wrote about my parents too. Yeah. So did he love your writing?
Yes. He was asking me constantly since my childhood that I should write. Yeah, but
So he knew you had
no.
great talent.
Well, yeah. Well, I didn't. I mean, I won't write ever. No, forget about it. Then one day I just started writing. So. He believed that arts and science are the only things that matter. So whether you are art or science, there's no way, no third way, you know, either or.
Oh, but not in business or law. Or
well, there was no business in law and justice.
Yeah.
You're forgetting.
See, my
that.
father.
60s, 70s.
My father wanted to be a scientist himself, so I think he would have liked it, especially if I had been interested in science. But given that I wasn't interested in science at all, he just wanted you to do whatever you loved. And he couldn't. He said, "I think philosophy seems useless to me, but if it's what you love, go ahead and do it." Yeah. So and then he died before I got my PhD, so he never really saw it.
Oh yes, great. There's a little history of art and of the world, actually. There's a little, it's great, a little Picasso moment up there. The whole world is here, a large part of it.
I didn't see
It's
a lot of
really
this sort of
nice.
sense of humour in Croatia. I was in Split
No
when they
Croatian
kept
jokes.
the Croatian Cup.
Oh, well, that must have been really exciting.
Well, I videoed it because it was so extraordinary. It was
all men again.
and in unison. It was the
Yeah.
Hitler Jugend. It was terrifying.
Yeah.
Made you remember the last 50 years of Croatian history in a flash.
It's true. Now, woman with opening thighs, surrounded by blank matchboxes, actually. Why is that?
Well, because it's all beyond. It's all
The
hopeful.
world.
It may happen.
May turn out well. Maybe a happy place.
He's probably led by the boredom.
Yes.
If something becomes very repetitive, then it's not his.
That he must move on, yes, I agree. To the next movement of the symphony.
Do you know him personally?
Yeah, I've known him for many years.
He was, I guess, an admirer of you.
Yes, I think, well, we've always been very, had a very good relation, actually. Now, he's a master of 19th century English.
Yes. Really?
Yeah, and he speaks as though he were giving a speech sometimes in Parliament in Gladstone's day, you know. And has that same kind of gentlemanly resonance.
And one more capacity of him, what I admire, is his handwriting. Have you seen his letters? Beautiful are the letters. Really.
Yes.
Like in the medieval codes.
We're talking about Gaspar Tamas, who's a friend of ours. A Budapest ex-dissident.
Most poets don't rhyme and have this free verse.
Yes.
Yeah. But this is also amazing because I was also wondering what this would mean, these rays. And that's
and these
something about
that has something to do perhaps with your experiences which you talked about. But
and look at
this is the first time they agree. Yes, and the white things, yes, I don't
like
know.
stars?
Yes. Like thoughts, like...
love bubbles?
Bubbles, yes. It's well, I think, yes, these paintings only produce questions about what happens here. What is the real happening? What are we looking at? Is he dying? Is he going? Is he...
I think here he is dying, definitely. I'm not sure about the child, but you suggest that they're all dying.
I suggest that there is some way leaving this earth by going into the earth. Yeah. And they're called by the painter himself, descent.
Descent.
In clear daylight.
It's very strange.
I like to see on the face.
I'm on the Stairmaster. It's ridiculous, yeah.
No, but I like to see on the face. Like, you can have all the
And that piece, it was a concerto that I was talking about in the actual broadcast.
Yes. Well, you said that's what you had in your head when you were didn't record it.
I just think, what would the women think? I didn't bring my camera, so I can't take a picture.
We have pictures of him.
And my favorite one is the least impressive. Isn't that interesting?
Which one?
That's my favorite. The sacred grasses.
From left?
Mm.
Why?
But I would just be, well, for numbers of reasons. Because this is a very typical utopia thing, because it's connected with the land in utopia. It's the sacred grasses. And it's just simpler, less ambitious. This is a very ambitious piece, this one.
I like them.
We need a little bit of wind. We need a movement of the air through the room.
That's too realistic.
No, it's not a question of being realistic. They're like the lightning blankets of the Navajo. They need to move.
But we can have a fan.
Yeah, little tiny fan would be enough. Just the tiniest, because they will. I can move them like this. Look, I'm a bit far away, but that's all the movement that you need, just like that.
But do designs like this go back by sand drawing?
Not at all. Well, yes.
It's like raking in the sand.
Yes, but it's closer to body painting. But as far as they're concerned, it's all the same thing. If you ask them, what is this pattern, they will usually say, awalye, which means everything. It's body painting, land pattern, identity, kinship, because it's all interconnected structure, of which they're only a part, which is why they don't sign anything, they don't care what happens to it, it just goes. And they would be vastly amused to see it in here.
Oh, that's very clever. It's like all the treasures revealed by machines. There's nothing there in the end. A journey towards a vast emptiness, isn't it? You're going to crash.
It's very amusing. Sir Simon Rattle has to learn German. It's a contract in 2 years before taking over the Berlin Philharmonic. And that's not so easy.
It's not so easy. Yes, actually you have to learn it.
It looks like it in the south of France. But there are buffaloes, no buffaloes in the south of France.
Well, I know they had the wild horses. I know they had the wild horses there, but I've never heard of buffaloes being there.
No buffaloes in the south of France, no. Horses maybe, yes.
I think the face of Menuhin, purposeful, concentrating, but somehow not intense. I mean, it's you can't say it's soothing to look at, but it's fascinating, and this is good.
It's complete.
Yeah, we have Two Beethovens, I'm interested. The only music in the exhibition is Ives and Beethoven. I asked for Schubert. Where was my Schubert? And I don't connect Beethoven with Beauty and Consolation at all.
Not at all.
Not at all, no. Inspiration maybe, but this is energizing music. It's good.
He writes crescendo each time, and really, it must be much more exalted. You must make let's do the stesso tempo. Just calm.
Klassenfoto. Leuk voor later. Maar een intrigerende samenkomst. Kun je die eigenlijk afdwingen? We probeerden de goden een handje te helpen. Na binnenkomst in galerie de Zaaijer aan de Keizersgracht, ooit een schuilkerk, waar de samenkomst zou plaatsvinden, zou een ensemble de 20 opwachten. Roger Scruton, de filosoof, zou de herkenningsmelodie spelen. U hoort hem al. Catherine Bott, de sopraan, zou de herkenningsmelodie zingen, waarvoor de woorden door Scruton waren geschreven. Er was niemand die niet in de stemming leek. En toen gingen ze naar de driehoek. Maar wat gebeurt er eigenlijk als je 20 mensen rond een tafel zet? Wie zullen proberen de discussie te claimen? Wie worden geïrriteerd? Wie zijn de verzoeners? Er zijn altijd een paar die er het zwijgen toe doen. Maar wie zou dat zijn? Zonder humor en zelfspot is dit leven ondraaglijk. Woorden van de natuurkundige Leon Lederman. Humor. Zelfspot. Hoeveel zou daarvan zo direct terug te vinden zijn? Er waren geen afspraken. Op die ene na dat er niet zou worden gerookt. De kwestie die op tafel lag, het was eigenlijk de enige, was de meest eenvoudige. De meest voor de hand liggende. Er leek niks bijzonders aan.
I would say my life to me is worth living because you never know every day when you wake up what's going to happen, what you're going to learn, who you're going to meet, how networks that you build up during your life may suddenly click into place. And I just find that even in difficult times, life is exciting and the lives of people around me are exciting, and we do have a choice. We could end it. We don't have to live.
If we were of opinion that it's not worth living, we'll just commit suicide, each one.
I say it is worth living for three reasons. First, family. Second, friends. Third, work, in that order.
I think that, obviously, to get a general theory of what makes life worthwhile is very hard, and each individual person must have something different to say about this. But I found life worth living since I've been able to so regulate it that I know exactly what's going to happen each day, and I wake up and I know exactly who I'm going to see. There are no surprises, nothing exciting, nothing out of the ordinary, everything harmonious, rhythmical, between getting out of bed and getting in again, and not ever clear whether it's better to be out of bed or in it.
In it, I think.
That's making a huge surprise. All coming to visit at one time.
Yes. No,
Hi there.
You would not be welcome. But if
I know.
If you corresponded with me in advance, that might be useful.
Did you say that life is worth living because of friends, family, etc.? It seems to me interesting because one suffers more, I would think, through family than through any other agency. And more through friends as well. I mean, the daily reality we have to deal with is misunderstanding and treachery. Any pretense in this company that family and friends are sources of unalloyed joy and that one understands the role one plays in our relationship with them, I'd have to reject it absolutely. The more you extend your network, the more you extend your capacity for suffering. If what we're talking about is suffering, I mean, are we asking, is suffering worth doing? I would say yes, because it's better than experiencing nothing at all. You know, I hurt, therefore I am. But this is just a kind of half-witted logical positivism that I really ought to know better than to pursue, I'd have thought.
I want to add one thing to Freeman's list, which I like very well, but justice. We think about this question, and we're sitting around here asking this question, but there are so many people in the world who never get a chance to ask that question because they die before they can learn to talk. And so I think, you know, as we pursue this question, we ought to think that one of the things that makes life worthwhile is getting to eat, to work, to live even long enough to ask that question. And what can we all do to bring that about? I think Jane, too, with her work with animals, is working with creatures who are treated so brutally that they don't get a chance to enjoy life such as it is. So what can we do to produce justice for human beings and for animals? I think that's one of the things we have to talk about.
In fact, you're saying, what can we do to make life worth living for others?
Yeah.
Well, I like sex better than justice, actually, I have to say. Really. I'm surprised, actually, it doesn't really come in anyone's early list, really. It's not just sex, you know. Gardening is pretty good. It's up there with sex. Really. Can be done at the same time as sex, actually.
Isn't that rather
if you manage things as well as Roger.
Isn't that rather the problem with a discussion like this? In a way, please forgive me, I think the question is the kind that you get in magazines. Describe yourself in 3 words. We've all got varyingly rude, disgusting, hedonist, moralistic, private lists of what makes our lives worth living. Sex, yes. Gardening, no. But we're not going to say on a programme like this, are we?
Why not?
Well, I think that... Why did everybody hold back right at the beginning?
It's because... Well, justice is more important to Martha than... It's the top of her list.
But also that justice is a concept that's more honoured in the breach than the observance. If you've ever had to deal with the business of dispensing justice, it seems preposterously inefficient. And the more well-developed it is, the more inefficient it is. Lawyers enjoy the process of dispensing justice. But I'm surprised that you should say sex, except, of course, that you are a man. And my perception has always been that sex is a blood sport. I know Roger has some thoughts about blood sport.
But you know, Jermaine, it's true that justice is inefficient, and it's true, of course, that anything you love and care about is a source of frustration as well as joy. But I think if there's reason to hope in this world, it's partly from the progress we have made even in getting angry at things we didn't used to get angry about. I mean, I think 100 years ago, no one got angry when animals were brutally slaughtered, and no one got angry when little girls were starved before they could learn to read and so on. And now at least we get angry about those things, and we think that something ought to be done, and I think that is progress.
So we're saying the angry life is more worth living than the unangry life?
I think so, yes.
So we're not after tranquility?
Everything that goes with sex and orgasm, yes, they go with beauty. But if you're talking about just raw, naked sense, what I think Germaine Greer referred to as blood sport, and I'm actually surprised to hear her, I thought actually you'd repudiated that idea of sex as a blood sport, pure and simple. I was rather surprised to hear you say that. I haven't been reading your latest, obviously.
I didn't say anything about pure, and I didn't say anything about simple.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very interested in blood sports from lots of points of view, because I think that predation is universal in nature, as far as I can see, and there is a prey role that has its own excitements. But sex doesn't cause simply pleasure. I mean, it causes all kinds of anxiety and insecurity and rage and hostility and death. It has at least as much negative component as it does positive.
Oh, good. And well, I'm very glad that you concede that, because...
I mean, I just said to Simon before, that we were looking at a little picture of... He said, why is there a little picture of a woman with her thighs parting and all the little squares around it are blank? And I said, because this is the one time when the man thinks he's going to get it right. And he said, delusive hope or something. What did you say?
I did, yes.
You see, so
hopeless delusion.
He's just pretending not to be intelligent at this point.
No, because I think women are just as much predators, sex-wise, as men are. I mean, there's no question at all about that, I hope. So that one cannot say it's just only one
Are you boasting
sex.
here?
It's just not, you cannot say it's just
But
one
actually,
sex,
I'd say
which is more predatory than the other. That's not my experience.
I mean, I agree, it's not, a simple source of beauty, for sure. But actually, I do think, really, the kind of unsuccessful quest for consolation is part of the sex act, actually, I would say.
There's an old-fashioned view about sex which I'm drawn to, which says that if you really value it, you wouldn't be able to talk about it in the way that you were talking about it. That there is something at stake which prevents us from overtly discussing this as though it were merely a matter of quantifiable sensual pleasure to be measured in terms of orgasms and so on. I'm not saying this view is entirely right, but it does inform all of our literature from Plato through Dante and Shakespeare up to T.S. Eliot. And there are a few things come after that which are worth reading, but not much on this subject. And so I suspect, we ought to be a bit more respectful of that old-fashioned view, which tells us that this is one of the things whose value lies in not being discussed.
Well, that's an end to that, then.
It is.
Yeah, well, but it isn't really. No, but I didn't mention the word orgasm, let alone the word quantifiable. So it's interesting you should attribute that to me.
No,
really.
I wasn't. I was vaguely saying this into the air.
No, you're very precisely saying it, Actually, I was more interested in the literally kind of pathetic, which actually it was right that I, think part of that is a sort of delusory search for consolation and comfort as well as exhilaration and excitement, and historically again the bearing of children as well. And I just find it very odd that actually, precisely maybe because we shouldn't use the word in this august company, that it seemed never to show up really as part of a discussion about beauty and consolation. I'm certainly, without being kind of awkwardly vulgar or fakely unintelligent, fraudulently unintelligent. There are moments, other than the moment of orgasm, a moment actually where you do love someone and you are, exploring a body or treating a body tenderly or treating a body selfishly or whatever. When you actually see that body with a very sharp sense of a desired object of beauty that strikes me as often incommensurable with other perceptions of beauty, and at least worth discussing. Maybe we've discussed it. Fine.
May I add something also? It's a bit a different angle. If you feel that life is worth living, and sometimes I have that feeling. There are moments you feel that life is worth living, and it may be, let's say, something very, very unimportant in the first sight. It may be a strike of light, or it may be a color you see, or it may be the laugh of a person. It's at the moment you realize that life is worth living. The question, what makes you think so, or what makes you feel so, is in fact unreachable and cannot be answered. It's always afterwards that we talk about it. But at the moment, it's something. It may be something which reminds us, without knowing, of something somewhere which you ever met or ever was dear to you, or something like that.
No, the question whether life is worth living, I think is makes no sense to me. I mean, we're living it, and it's either worth it or doesn't. And I agree with Rutger. When each day you decide whether something is worth living, and it happens that the little things, that the glass is there and not there, that there's water in it. Many people don't have water in it. The weather changes, things like that. Actually, what Jane said, that it's worth living if you have to answer the question, because you don't know what happens next.
But why complain about the question when we have the power to turn this question into anything we want it to be? And so if I wish I got a little more pleasure out of where the water is and whether it's full or not, that doesn't particularly move me, but I think we're also different here. I came to the Netherlands a day early, and I went to visit one of the universities, and there at a talk I gave were two women who represent 200 families who are involved in false accusations in this country. And they said, we want to give you something. And so I wore it today. It's a pin from Zealand. And Zealand has a motto, I struggle and I emerge. And that's what these families have been going through. And so to me, I mean, just that experience coming here, being at that university, being able to talk to those women about their struggle and their emergence, that makes life worth living for me.
Why everything in struggle, in terms of struggle? We talk about terms of struggle, order, sex. It's all struggle. But is it struggle, really? Or is it just going down slowly towards the end?
I don't know. I mean, Germaine, I'll paraphrase you. I hate, therefore I am, or whatever. I hurt. I hurt.
I like the substitution.
I network, though I am.
I thought we were being a little unfair to the question, being reductionist in a way, because life obviously doesn't just mean exhaling. Obviously, life also means the entire gamut of experience. And I think that question really asks, are there moments when we experience certain things which make us feel, well, we're glad that we're in a condition to experience those things? Like what she's just spoken about, like friendship, like loyalty. I know friendship is a word which I find in Europe doesn't mean too much these days, because friendship is sometimes equated with having an end. You see a man and a woman, there's no understanding that the possibility of friendship as such exists. You see a man and a man, you don't think of friendship anymore. Are they sleeping together or whatever? Sex has overtaken, I'm sorry, the European brain, the European mind. And you know, what you just need to listen to, you know, talks on shows and, you know, arguments and discussions in journals, learned journals, just sex. Things like friendship no longer means anything. But there are moments when you have an experience of friendship in which you no longer think of the issue of exhaling, are you dead or alive? Suddenly, you're glad to be what you are at that time, experiencing what you're experiencing. And I suspect that this is what that question was really asking.
See, I think the question is really two questions. What makes an individual person's life worth living, and what makes human life as a part of the human species, worth living? And they really are different questions. And I think I was answering the second one before, thinking that we're part of a species that's done so much terrible and horrible stuff to one another, to the planet, to animals. And so what makes it worth being a part of that species? And the only thing I can think of to answer that is the hope of doing it better, the hope of making some progress. I mean, an individual's life has so many parts, but to be a part of the human species is something that we all are stuck with, and we've got to ask what makes that worthwhile.
Again, there's no choice.
Well, no, but then what can we do to make that species do something better than it's done before?
They tried. Nothing came out of it.
Well, I think, you know, I mean, Kant said this thing once in the Theory and Practice. He said, well, you know, what is the reason to have hope for global justice? When we look around, we see everything is a mess and it's tragic, childish folly. But at the same time, we at least see that we're more angry about it than we were before. And if that's so, then that means maybe our moral sensibilities are expanding, and then that might mean that there's some hope.
I think there's a point that is implicit in Martha's remarks that seems to me important. For everything except justice, sex, friendship, family, physics, work, philosophy, these are all optional. That is, if these play no role in your life, well, that's all right, something else does. You know, you may get nothing out of music, you may get nothing out of physics, there are other things that give meaning to your life. Justice is different from all those other things. And as Martha said, the first question can be answered in a million ways, and there's no right answer to it. There's some sense in which justice is the only thing which could count in this area as a right answer.
That is a distinction between living life pleasantly and living it well. And that, I think, is something that, again, what Dick Rorty discerned in what Martha had said, which is very important, that for us, at least, human beings, there's a distinction between living life well and living it badly. And that, perhaps, is part of what we mean by the worthwhileness of life, that we have this option, that we can live it well. And by being conscious of what that is to live it well, and that's a very difficult one, and pursuing it, we can't then have the question whether it's worthwhile what we're doing.
See, I think one reason this question comes up is that we are creatures with these ethical sensibilities, and yet we've also done such a terrible amount of evil. And so the reason we might ask ourselves, is it worth living, is when we see that we see we have the capacity to choose the good, and yet so often we've done the most terrible things. And so then we have to ask ourselves, is it worth being a part of that species?
Well, then again, there is no choice.
Well, no, but I mean, that's what makes one think, is it worth being alive on this world? Yeah.
Either one really feels really gung-ho about actually the possibility, active possibility of improving the kind of moral norm by which we conduct our cultures, or it's sticking your head in the gas oven tomorrow morning. That seems to me absurd, actually. It seems to me kind of false dichotomy.
I don't know. I mean, I don't think you have to have a hope for universal progress to keep your life going. But the hope that piecemeal, there can be some good done by human beings.
I'm much more cheered by the mess of humanity, I have to say, actually. I mean, I feel actually more, it's true there's mess and mess, atrocity, nightmarish horror, of course, one is not in the slightest bit consoled by. But actually, the notion that really we're put on this earth, and in order to feel good about life, we have to be absolutely convinced that we're engaged in a shared moral enterprise to kind of improve our collective lot. I find unbelievably high-mindedly bleak and certainly not consoling and not beautiful, actually. Not beautiful. It's from that kind of platonic positivism that an awful lot of misery has actually inadvertently been caused.
Not the only conception of the ethical life, though, is it? If, Martha's putting across one view in which justice is absolutely central, and also penitence for all the evil done by our species. But there are lots of other conceptions which are, in this way, moral, in which you might say there isn't that pretension to rectify all the damage done, but nevertheless there still is such a thing as conscientiously living your life well, and that can be beautiful. I mean, the pictures given of that in the literature in 19th century novels, for example, are often very moving, and often you think, yes, it is beautiful both for the person who's doing it and also for as a spectacle for others around.
I think there's also a problem about the monolithic concept of justice, because it implies that you don't actually have conflicting interests within social groups and now species groups, and that you can be just to one without being unjust to another. And maybe there is such a view of the world, but I would frankly be terrified of it, because I think we have to understand that conflict is what we're geared for, bred for, programmed for, and that peace is what we're bad at. And that what one wants to do, in some senses, is to contain the conflict and have it manageable. This is why I was interested in the assumption that it would be pleasure or harmony or something that made life worth living, because it seems to me that life is essentially conflict. And one of the questions we're asking is whether the conflict is worth the collateral damage. And what I would say is that there is no alternative. The only alternative is to opt out, which in my terminology is no alternative at all. I don't regard the cessation of life as an option, as an equivalent to the continuation of life, which is why I took the line that I did in the beginning, that life is what is and not life is what isn't, and all you can do is leave the system. And that's why, in a way, it's not worth discussing whether the system is worth continuing in view of the fact it is the only system. But we seem to have fundamentally different notions. If one would think that what would justify our existence would be the thought that we could bring this thing called justice to all suffering creatures, then we're on a hiding to nothing. It's not going to happen.
But I think justice implies the absence of conflict. I mean, actually, I think you would have no point for an account of justice unless you have pervasive conflicts. Aristotle said it was silly to think of the gods paying deposits and making contracts and things of this sort. I mean, for beings to have justice if they don't have conflict makes no sense. Justice is a reasonable way of adjudicating the pervasive conflicts that everyone has for resources and opportunities and so on.
What Germaine said, we have different notions. I'm not sure that's true. That's true. But what we have much more, and it doesn't come out, we have different desires.
Yeah. And there's a scarcity of things. There's a scarcity of food and a scarcity of shelter. And we have to find some way of arranging life so that we all get a fair share.
Some people desire excitement. Roger, I desire the same thing. I mean, the most pleasurable thing for me is that everything is totally ordered. There's nothing, and still you have the desire that something might change, but within that order, so that actually the change is observable and not too sudden.
But that's funny, because when you were talking about days being perfectly predictable, I mean, to some of us,
They
that
never
meant
are.
utter boredom. Jesus, I hope something surprising happens today. And amongst the things that happen is you trip over a pavement and it split your kneecap, you know.
Yes,
I mean,
you go to the hospital and you meet somebody.
Well,
and,
first of
you
all,
know,
life cannot be
a
ordered
dog
in this
bites you,
way. And
you get
secondly,
AIDS.
if we were talking about something ordered in that way, we wouldn't be talking about life as we live it, because it's full of
No, but
potential
in the
catastrophe.
entire literature, everything it starts with chaos, or the idea of, and it gets into a narrative which is an order, that something happens after each other, and then things come together, and they cross, and there's a complex, it's the same in painting.
But that's
Or
art, not life.
But that's why art is better than life.
But art is a part of life, so that's a nonsensical thing to say as well.
No, art is sublimation, is an old-fashioned word. Art is that thing that leads us possibly to paradise. That's what we have lost. Culture is the reconstruction of paradise. We have failed until now, but it might still be the same thing.
But I want to be sure of something. You were speaking tongue-in-cheek, weren't you, when you spoke about regularity, knowing what's going to happen next.
Slightly tongue-in-cheek.
Yes,
but nevertheless,
I just wanted to be sure.
No, but I think there is a false view of human happiness which says that it consists always in change and expectation and so on. There is this other aspect of it, and it's partly a matter of temperament, but it is the case also that there are people who are not so keen on having that constant change, and this pursuit of excitement and diversity and change is part of what causes the terrible catastrophes that Martha worries about. I mean, Pascal famously said that all of life's troubles come from man's inability to sit at home at his desk. You know, okay, it's a silly thing to say in a way, because who made that desk? But nevertheless, you can see the point of that.
You know what, listening to all these discussions, which are very interesting, but actually you are all talking about this same thing. You are just talking about what you like in life, and that's all. So you love these things and someone else loves the opposite things. It's still the same thing. You find things in life why you think life is worth living. But there is another side of it. For example, when you feel, and it happens to you, for example, you are depressed for a long time, that life is not worth living, and nothing, be it sex or books or I don't know what, friends, family, nothing causes you to feel that life is worth anything at all. Because that's how you feel when you are depressed. It's all the same. It all happens to someone else, someone on your surface. It's just some ripples on your surface and nothing else. You do not feel emotions that you should feel. You know that you are supposed. I was never deeply depressed, I believe, because then there's no way out without medicine. And I managed to get out without anything at all, through only one thing, music. And it was just, it cured me in the shortest possible time. Well, I don't know, a couple of weeks. But for about a year and a half, maybe two, because I didn't notice when it started, but I started going down in a way. I say down, it's just a metaphor. Never mind. I started feeling less and less and less. I know what I was supposed to feel, but nothing happened to me, you know? There was no joy in anything at all. I saw things the way I did. I thought the way I did. The intellect was not, didn't go away. But it was a kind of strange and interesting thing to feel from inside that your intellect has nothing to do with your emotions and thus life. The intellect is something extra that is given to you, just a good instrument, but it's useless. I don't want to have it even. Even I would prefer to be absolutely dumb as a nail, so that not think about what I'm experiencing emotionally. And through music, I went out of this state. And then when it was over, I looked back and I thought, here it is. It's like a dark valley, twilight valley, I would say. It's not completely dark, emotional twilight. And now it's all over. Now I feel I am back. I feel the way I'm supposed to, I guess. But there is a state of mind, emotion, not mind, I guess. But this time in life, rather, when life is not worth living. But I didn't commit suicide. I did nothing of the kind. And my own question is why? because I didn't really find anything worth living. I was indifferent. I thought, if I'm run over by the car, it'll be okay. Of course, I don't want to feel pain. I want it to be instant death, but I don't mind. I really don't mind.
Your story about depression, I mean, that's dead on the point. There has to be a kind of receptivity to feeling that life is worthwhile. There's no outside thing there. There's no attitude. There's no single thing you can do to make life worthwhile. There has to be a state that's in your head that allows you to feel that life is worthwhile. The thing I was curious about with the business of depression, and I think this about people talking about is life worth living, in some degree, it seems to me that you fall into two camps. There's those who think life is worth living because of the history they've had. The life they've lived has been worth living. And then there's people who think that life is worth living because of which is yet to come, which is into the future. And I suspect in the case of depression, neither of those is operative. Is that right? Is that what you felt?
I would say yes, but there are many different kinds of depression and many grades, I would say, of depression, as far as I know. And, well, you may feel really low or indifferent. When you look back, you know mentally that there was a wonderful life, but it's not there anymore, so it makes no difference whether it was or was not. Could be someone else's life. The life I read about in a book, really no difference. As for the future, you don't believe that this state of depression will go away.
Can I go back to Freeman Dyson's point? Actually, I was very moved by his picture. And Freeman said in response, family, children, and Germaine said, well, conflict, hatred, torture, dispute, and so on. And that was the end of that. And if we reverse the question and said, well, not, if we hate life, we're going to commit suicide, but supposing we played the game about you have 1 week to live, what actually would be, what you would miss, really. Missing the pleasure of children and family, that would be very high on my list, I have to say. My list of regrets. So I would just like to hear, I don't know, maybe nobody wants to talk about that, even less than about sex.
It must be, and I mean this from the heart, my fault, that I find all this deeply embarrassing. The whole occasion. Deeply embarrassing. My fault. I listened to Tatiana, very moved, and I want to know what the hell business of mine is it, your depression? None whatever. I judge the maturity of a human being by the refusal to confess. To be grown up is not to share certain things with others. I'm thinking on an occasion like this of Emily Dickinson's fantastic phrase, it is now late afternoon in the soul, late afternoon. Or perhaps a feeling of that the soul too can have jet lag, as a number of us around this table probably have. It's so bloody embarrassing, isn't it? Now, to a question like, is life worth living? Mark Twain, the journalists asked him that exact question when he landed in Liverpool, and he said, gentlemen, I've been told the alternative is worse. Which is a wonderful answer. He's a very deep man. If you can say to a group of public under cameras, strangers or friends, let them be what you will, if you can phrase what to you makes life worth living, the absolute center, it's a lie. It's a lie. Because it's nobody else's business. It's a self-deception. I think it probably lies lower than speech or on the other side of speech for many human beings. It is not articulable. It is certainly not publicly communicable. And if, for example, I were to try the proposition, what makes life worth living is the death of an enemy, that's when the heart sings. That's when the heart sings. I could, for example, put that forward.
You
are saying that certain personal things ought not to be publicly communicated, but you're also saying that anything that can be publicly communicated must be a lie. And I think those are two different claims.
Right,
and are you then really meaning to say that
self-deception.
no kind of public commitment, no ethical or political commitment is ever anything but a lie?
It is highly suspect. One asks whom it is meant to impress. One asks whom is one showing off to in a group like this.
But why should one think that only the hidden things are the most real? Why should one think that at all?
Oh, I think many people do. They're desperate to impress others, to persuade them, to solicit them. And what makes life worth living
to impress anyone?
Is so private a thing.
They might try to lie to themselves
so
too.
Intimate a thing, but I spoke also of self-delusion.
Yeah.
That articulacy conveys the constant danger of a rhetoric of self-delusion. So I withdraw the word lie with pleasure and say a rhetoric of self-deception, of exhibitionism. We are in a society of unparalleled exhibitionism at every level.
What are you doing here?
But George, if the thing that's said is good and worthwhile, then what difference does it make if the person is sincere? I mean, who cares at some level whether Abraham Lincoln was sincere about this or that thing that he did in the abolition struggle? Because, I mean, what he did is what counts, and the words counted, even no matter what the hidden psychology behind it was.
Surely, George, you have a point, and the point is that we all should be more embarrassed than we seem. But probably we are. You know, so there's bound to be an element of a histrionic element, an element of play acting, and your rhetoric is so much part of that. We couldn't actually be ourselves without sensing the fact that you're about to come out with some such thing at any moment. You know, so it's all part of the game, isn't it?
But when I'll accept that, but it would be very troubling, part of the game, if one sacrificed to that the real inward of one's convictions.
Absolutely. But this is a very important thought. To what extent do you, by exposing before strangers that which really motivates your life, to what extent do you thereby lose that thing? Sometimes exposing yourself to strangers, and I mean that in both senses, does take away from you something. And that was the point of what I said earlier about sex. There are certain things which have an enormous meaning, but their privacy is part of that meaning. But we haven't really been talking about those things yet, have we? None of us have actually talked about their private relations with this or that person, but only with the structure within which those values can be conveyed.
Well, that's not quite true. One person did talk about her private experiences and then got told that she was immature for being so self-revealing.
But she didn't reveal very much.
Well, she only she's half depressed.
She only revealed what we think that all Russians feel at some stage in their life.
First of all, there is a huge difference in cultures, in West European culture and in Russian culture, and the degree of openness in public is absolutely amazingly different. That's one thing. Another thing is that I know very well what you are talking about, the feeling that one often has in life, especially in youth, that when you talk to strangers, you lose something and it cannot be retrieved. It's really like losing your innocence, a physical innocence, time after time after time, well, until nothing is left. But that is immature, that very feeling. You overcome that. You try to build, during your lifetime, a kind of a shell. And this shell is becoming thicker and thicker and thicker, and it allows you to keep something really private and having a very curved and strange form inside, to keep it completely locked from one's eyes. What you can say after that goes through some filter. It's not lie. It is a truth, if you decide to be truthful. I see nothing wrong in lying. Absolutely nothing wrong in lying. But I choose to say the truth because why not? What's so important about this gathering? Why not say the truth? But it is kind of distilled like through certain filters. And you feel that you can let it go. But the real thing, the one that sits deep there, you wouldn't be able to tell people even if they beat you up. That's how, unfortunately, this shell grows. It divides you somehow in two different spheres. One goes out to the public, another remains, and you cannot say it to yourself because there's no words. Words are lost there. It's the dark hole, you know? So I think that's unfortunately what maturity is in our late age. Unfortunately, it's very unpleasant.
Yes, if what has been revealed here so far, nobody has actually said that this is what makes my life worth living. Only one person said, this is what saved me from depression. So if really this has been the most intimate, and I come from a culture, frankly, George, and here I empathize with you absolutely, I come from a culture which is totally shocked at the kind of public confessional which, let us say, American society in particular is. And I suspect this is where this kind of structure you sort of imposed on this gathering. And I absolutely agree with you of the level of horror with which I view the most intimate revelations being absolutely splurged out on television screen, on the media, in the most abominable way. And I say, don't these people understand anything called privacy or shame any longer? But I don't think that we've reached that, or that we reached that level in this gathering. And I think what you did was, state your fears before we even got too far. That's really what I suspect has happened in this particular case.
There is an assumption that a lot of people are sharing here that I'd like to question, and that is that the truest and deepest is the most interior, the most ineffable. And there's some core of ourselves that some deep feeling or set of psychological attitudes that maybe not even expressible in words, and if we could only touch that, that's the deepest thing. Now, I don't know why one should think that. I mean, certainly it's a very peculiar modern romantic idea, that idea. And the idea, I mean, it means, in effect, that conduct is less real than this inner thing. And so why should we think that? Why shouldn't we think that our ethical conduct or any public expression is just as real?
Isn't the core idea of what George was saying, not that the things that mean so much to us are ineffable, but they're only effable, so to speak, in private, in front of somebody with whom one is intimate. It's a gesture of intimacy to reveal them, and I would agree with that. Yeah?
What about the proposition that what makes life worth living is the biochemistry of the brain? I mean, one way of regarding endogenous depression is that it's an imbalance in mineral salts in the brain, and you can take a little lithium and it'll all be over.
Yep. Is that right?
Maybe we're deluded in thinking life is worth living, and it's just because our brains are relatively healthy that we think life is worth living.
Yeah. Or because our brains are relatively ill.
Quite. Who would know the difference?
Your dialectic can work perfectly.
Indeed.
Either way.
You could twist this thing around and say, look around you at other people and pick out the lives that we think have been worth living, because of what's happened as a result of those lives. That was a life that was worth living in our own perception, anyway.
In fact, Wally, I think enormously intimate things have been said if one listened. Enormously intimate. You and I happen to be in the same boat. That is to say, I now ache at every moment for the hours from now when I will be with my old English sheepdog, who is the center of my life, as it happens. And I think you and I understand instinctively what that moment means, and this magnificent being doesn't talk, which, of course, is the key to communication in many ways. And all I want to add is a footnote for Tatiana. I can't quote the text verbatim, it's almost verbatim. 3 times I was within an hour of suicide when the slow movement in Brahms' third quartet pulled me back. Ludwig Wittgenstein. 3 times I was within. But he wrote that note, dated it, and sealed it. And it is only long after his life he certainly regarded it as none of our damn business.
Fine,
and
fine.
We have now dug it up because...
Fine. So what? What is literature about? That not trying to make a public confession?
Because we live in a period of such expository nakedness. What gives a human being dignitas? preeminent dignity and makes it resistant to the state. It is the ability to keep in oneself the great secret, the great pain. I take your image of the shell, which is a very important image. You say they beat you, did I hear you rightly? And the shell doesn't break. I think I heard you rightly. And thank God that there are people whose shell, thank God. And I'm haunted by my own physical cowardice. I imagine 2 minutes after they would start beating me, I'd start telling everything. I don't know. I know that if they started beating my dog, in 30 seconds I would spill the whole bloody... So when your shell, help me on that image, which is an important one, if the shell is strong enough when they beat you, hallelujah.
There's something I think you need to consider if we're talking about the great British shell. The British work so hard at constructing a shell around their internal reality that they forget about the eternal reality. The truth is that the shell is empty.
That the shell
is empty. The shell is all there is. When what you do, when you spend your entire life making yourself impervious, the example I like to give is the attitudes of various nations to the 3 little words, I love you. You know, the Frenchman may say it whenever. The Italian says it hoping it might one day be true. Ti amo. The Englishman never says it for fear that one day it might not be true, and so you never hear it. And it remains the unsayable thing, because of this notion of integrity, which in the end means you've got nothing but shell. And if you don't verbalize thoughts, the chances are you don't have them. I mean, it's going to be difficult to start a discussion here about whether you can think without language, but I happen to think you don't think terribly well without language. Your dog might understand you without language, but not too many other people would. And what is madness after all but speaking a private language, barking when you should be speaking, and so on. So what I'm saying is that in this anxiety to protect the untouchable centre of yourself, you end up having no untouchable centre of yourself. They could beat you and you wouldn't break, because in fact you're all shell. You're a blind nut. There's no kernel there.
Okay, but look, Americans say, I love you about 180 times a day, and still they are very, very more than often empty inside.
They don't even know you.
No, absolutely, but
the first thing, I love you all.
Occupant. And it's like saying bye-bye on the phone.
Yeah.
Like saying bye-bye.
Isn't this a very...
We're using this expression.
I was going to slightly change the subject, but what I was going to say is irrelevant. But maybe we could look at your question and put it in my context, and that is that once upon a time, all of our parts were blended together in some cosmic explosion that began the universe, and it spread out and it expanded and somehow condensed, and there was one speck which was called the Milky Way galaxy, and it fragmented in billions of stars, and some of these stars developed little planets around them, and here we are on one of these planets, and accumulations of all kinds of materials, and out of the ocean crawled some organic goo, and eventually out of a miracle of a miracle of a miracle of a miracle, we evolved. And it's very, very likely that something like this never happened, never will happen in this whole universe. And so it seems to me that when you ask the question, is life worth living, it's kind of sacrilegious on a much deeper sense than religious. It's sacrilegious in a spiritual sense, that somehow this miracle happened, that we're alive. Miracle is defined as something of extremely low probability.
Okay.
But you have violated the strongest of the modern taboos, which is not to talk about religion.
Would you allow the hypothesis, when you speak of the miracle, would you allow the question that if that miracle has led to mass extermination, as it has, to sadism on a scale inconceivable to the human mind, to a planet on which 3/5 of people are hungry, would you still opt? This is where the notion of miracle troubles me. It's an anthropomorphic notion. And it's a notion which prejudges the results. Now, it may well be right, not, but I think there is behind your remark the immense good luck of our very privileged way of living, of our tinily privileged and rewarded way of living. For the children, and it's been massive, as you know, in this latest war, last week's war, till next week's, who have both arms and legs cut off in the African war, the notion that this has been a miracle, sorry, I can't buy it. I have no better answer, but I would be very, very careful about the teleology of the utopian in your very poignant and very eloquent remark.
Well, again, I only repeat, perhaps I shouldn't have used the word, but a more technical word would be boring. But I just mean it a process of extremely low probability. Therefore, it's not meant to imply that somebody organized this. I don't believe anybody organized this. I think it just happened.
And you approve?
Oh, no, approve. That's a personal opinion, which I was told that you shouldn't express.
Right.
There is the thing, going back to this question of understanding, it is curious. I mean, that is certainly one of the things that to many of us gives you the sense, or I think to many people gives the sense that this is worthwhile. Life is waiting for these explanations, which seem to tumble forward. And there is a kind of, as a group. I mean, it seems to me there's a two kinds of discussion going on. One being, has been a worthwhile life as seen from the outside, as seen from a group, what you've done, what these people have accomplished, what Jane Goodall was saying. And then from the other side, internally, what does it feel that life is worth living or not? And these are, is it worthwhile or not? These are separable things. But one of the things I think that is motivating, at least, if we can use that word, is the idea that these things are going to be explained. Germaine Greer raised the question of, can we really talk about, is life worthwhile from the point of view of the brain soup? And of course we can, because things like depression, things like elation, things like, I feel, what is the brain state that says this is all worthwhile and I feel great and it's good about it? We do know a lot about that, and we discover more about that all the time. It's fun waiting for that. It's motivating. It does seem to give a point to it. And the same on the other side with the physics. Maybe in the end we really will understand all that. So I see these two kinds of things going together here, though. I mean, is it worth all that effort looked at as the horror that it's created, or as the goodness that, or whatever word you want to use, that it's done? That's one kind of discussion. And then there's another kind of discussion, is from inside your own shell, inside your own world, is it worth it?
Please bear in mind that one of the paradoxes is that the object of the waiting or of the obsession can be totally trivial. Men have killed for a postage stamp. Oh, yeah. Men have given their lives to finding one subspecies of an orchid. One of the mysteries, and Nietzsche was about the only one to be frank on this, he said much more powerful than love or hatred is being interested in something, and which is absolutely right. And then there's no use saying don't be interested in such a trivial thing. Exactly, absolutely right. No use. One cannot negotiate one's passions. One shouldn't, even if they are somewhat murderous. And if you live your passion totally, probably most of what we're talking about is beautifully irrelevant. And what there is, if you're right, I have no confidence even to raise, maybe there is a synapse of obsession, maybe there is a wiring of total interest, and that neurochemistry will one day teach us about it, but I doubt very much whether it can explain the magnificent, well, that kitsch title, Magnificent Obsession, the totality of commitment to something inherently. We have a recent case which takes my breath away. A South American collector paid millions for 2 identical stamps, they're the only 2, and then burnt the one immediately. And It numbs me by its cold intelligence.
Yes. Were they identical, George?
Yes, two identical. And now
How
there's
did
only
he
one.
choose?
But you see, but
or was it arbitrary?
I agree with you. I agree with you completely. I think that what will be learned is what that state is, that state that allows you to be interested. But the machine will never, but what won't be explained is what the interest is directed at. But whether the interest is there or not, that kind of business is the business of the brain people.
May I make a question? Why do we need so much consolation? Why is this theme beauty and consolation, and why not interest and inspiration? Why do we all need consoling all the time?
I think that's actually one of the things that discriminates between people, distinguishes people. Past the age of 40, I think it comes into play. There's a lot of people who actually are quite miserable with the way it all turned out and resent their fate and are bitter about it and find themselves very unhappy about it. And there's another group of people who simply aren't, who say, well, I did this right and that right, and it's turned out well, and they're quite happy with it. I think
but there's a third choice, isn't there? Saying that's just what happened.
Of course there is. I'm talking statistically here. If we go about and go out into the world and ask past age 40, and you poll the population or do whatever you like, deal with them as patients, whatever you do, you'll find that is a source of great misery or a great source of great solace as to what has happened in their lives. And perhaps it's the case that everyone here, being very successful, would answer the question, well, yes, of course. Of course, we take consolation in our past. But is it the case that a large number of people past a certain age trace the bulk of their misery to the fact that that these things happened in their lives? And I think the answer to that question is yes.
But what can console us for the Holocaust? I don't understand. What can console us for Hiroshima? There is no consolation. How would looking back on your own life console you for that? How can you be consoled for the loss of species? How can you be consoled for the salination of Western Australia by thinking back on your own life?
But surely the nature of that question is essentially solipsistic, as most of the questions are.
Well, I wanted to just remind people around this table of something that they already know, which is the whole philosophical tradition, which starts with Socrates' assertion that the unexamined life is not worth living. The tradition which finds the meaning and the redemption of the individual life in the retrospective vision of it. You know, that you elicit that meaning from it now, looking back over it, when you see it as all unchangeable. And obviously the high point in this came in our century with Proust, but it's there in all our literature and all our religion, actually, in the Judeo-Christian tradition.
But you know, Roger, Socrates did not mean looking for the ineffable personal meaning of your personal life. He meant asking questions like, what is justice, what is piety, and so on, all those
sure,
questions.
okay, but he started, nevertheless, this tradition of thinking that life itself should be examined, and it can't be examined before it's happened. It can only be examined after it's happened. If the question is, what is your
but to think about life is much more productive than to think about your own life, because you can't change your own life, but you might just possibly, in the little time you've got left, be able to change something about the future of somebody else's life or your family's life, whatever.
Hang on. Thinking about something does change it, especially when it's something in the past, because all that it is a memory. This is the whole purpose of Proust's book, to show that that material is now infinitely malleable, now that it is over and done with. Because you can elicit the meaning in it by rearranging it, by seeing connections in it which couldn't ever have been discovered at the time. And I'd have thought that this is one of the few things that distinguishes our condition from that of everything else on our planet, and in times of trouble can make us think that, phew, there's something that I can still do.
As memory fails, what happens is confabulation. And one of the things that's going on in À la recherche du temps perdu is confabulation. It's constructing a past that never happened. The past is not text. I mean, one of the things we do is we write the apologia for our lives when we do all that re-remembering. We actually reorganize events in order to make them palatable. That's one of the ways in which we construct personality. It's one of the ways we we invent ourselves day by day and continue to justify our behaviours. But it ought not to offer us consolation. We ought to be unconsoled. We ought to be unconsolable. I reject consolation. I don't want it. I don't want to feel better about the way this world is. Indeed, I think I ought to be working harder at feeling a good deal worse.
I don't want to work at making things worse or better. I'd rather not do that. I know that when I look back, I have a great deal of anger, for obvious reasons. I feel that I would rather have spent a certain number of years in some other direction than dealing with these tuppenny murderers, dictators, and torturers who fill my life in my own society. So I can tell you personally that looking back on my life, and it's that public aspect of my activities, no consolation there at all. I would rather have been doing something else. But they keep turning up, they keep churning themselves out, reinventing themselves, and interfering with what I consider should be a very rational, humane and just condition and entitlement of society. So for me, this is a very... But at the same time, I cannot deny that, I've had moments of enormous, positive experiences. But looking back, I say that just looking back gives me consolation is something which, just doesn't exist for me. I agree that there's no reason why I should seek consolation out of it, but I disagree that it should make me angry. I'd rather not be angry. I'd rather not feel resentful. So I just take it. It happened, and that's that.
People find themselves at a certain time with costs they've paid. In other words, this is where you are, this is where you could have been, but you are here now because you did something, and that something now has changed your life and left you here. You can only go so far in rearranging the content of memory. There are built-in sorts of rules that seem to be there, at least for most people, that restrict what you can do with the content of memory. And so you can't just build a past and then say that's my past and live with it. That doesn't seem to work. That leads to a kind of psychosis.
There's something almost monstrous about the notion of looking back on one's life with much satisfaction. Almost monstrous after a certain age. One can write an autobiography called Errata in the absolute purpose to try to see where it all went wrong and not to lie about it and to be very precise about it. The point being that the saddest words in the human language are the two little words, too late. And when you know absolutely that it is too late, then it's time to stop fooling oneself and at least to try and make, all right, borrow the Marxist notion of self-criticism. It was a very powerful notion in many ways, had very positive aspects, and to train oneself to stop being, I agree with you, consoled. To be consoled about one's own past life is, I think, monstrous. But I want to say one other thing. What Proust gave to the relatively few, though the number is large, but to the relatively few who can really read him, passes, in my conviction, any political reform. What Proust has given to us, no damn program of political agitation or liberal whatever can come near. Proust has actually expanded the possibilities of human consciousness. Very, very few. Shakespeare's done, of course, Dante. But it's in that class. And
would you trade Proust for the end to slavery?
Pardon?
Would you trade Proust for the end to slavery?
Yes, as it happens, I would. And as it happens, you're not
for
going
you.
to end slavery. Nothing you can do will end it. It is spreading. And the point is, when we're frank, when we're mandarins like you and I, in this privileged profession, in our privileged life, for many of us, the destruction of a great painting, the destruction of a great library, when we are truthful, has a hurt and an immediacy which, alas, the destruction of many lives.
I can't believe that you're saying that, George. I can't believe that somebody who's thought about evil and anti-Semitism, as you have, would actually say the thing you just said here.
Proust, who had thought about these things very deeply too, educated consciousness to new riches, to unprecedented riches.
You think it's okay, so for some people to have no chance to have a life free from humiliation and indignity, so long as a couple of bourgeois people can have an educated consciousness?
Not a couple of bourgeois, a very large number.
No, well,
but
all right.
I'm
Who
convinced.
cares?
Why bourgeois?
I'm convinced.
Why bourgeois necessarily?
I'm convinced that in the name of trying to abolish the things you want to abolish, more evil has been done. That in the name of a dogmatic meliorist program, the millions are slaughtered.
Well, all right, we know that sometimes people who set out to do good do great evil, so that's true. So does that mean it's not good ever to set out to do good? That it seems to me appalling that you would bring back slavery for the sake of Proust. I cannot believe that you say that. I think you said that to make an effect, and you don't really mean that.
Bring it back, and you are doing nothing to abolish it. So parity for parity.
May I pose another question?
I think it is abolished.
Would you give Proust for the kind of political action and commitment which was taken, which was required, and the changing of consciousness, human consciousness, which was required to terminate the Nazi program of the Holocaust? Would you say, for instance, a work like Proust is worth the effort, the political program, the political commitment, whether it took the form of Marxism or whatever, and we know very well the evils of Marxism also, nobody's denying that. But when you try to weigh one thing against another, that's where I am bothered.
No, I don't weigh them. The hope was that the education of consciousness would make barbarism less probable, that was the hope. And very late in my life, I'm very skeptical that the humanities have humanized it all. That's all.
You talk about humanity as if humanity is a whole block of whatever. It consists of separate people. Some people are very, very good, even saints. Some people are extremely bad, disastrous, tyrants, murderers, whatever. And there are many people in the middle. And this middle is moving all the time like that. More than that, there is also a vertical thing, I would say, not only horizontal. We are made of good and bad. It's together. It's not that I'm a bad person or a good person. It depends whether I'm bad or good in different given circumstances. And I must say that works of great art, whether you agree or disagree exactly whether this particular art is great. For me, it's great art. What I consider to be great art, or just nice art, or even kitsch, but I love it. For me, it may save me from doing something evil. Because when I like something, when I love something, for me, it really may stop me from doing some evil thing. And many people are that way. You cannot be either only a murderer or a saint. It's one thing. And there is no trade we are talking about. No one trades these things. These things never happen. There's no place on earth where these things are traded. So this question is irrelevant, whether you would trade this for that or the other way around. And whom to save? For example, the house is on fire. Whom to save? A picture or, I say, a human being or 100 human beings? It widely depends. First of all, you cannot make clear decisions when you are in that house. You are not invulnerable. You cannot just walk in the flames and pick up whatever. Right. You are in panic. I was in the house when it was took on fire. I thought, I ran from this house, I thought that I made, sorry for personal remarks, I thought I made extremely wise decisions. First, I took my children out of this house, 2 small children, then I returned back, it was on fire. I returned back and took the most important things I could find there, took it out, returned the 3rd time, and took again the most important things. I thought, how clever and cold I am. I'm doing the right thing. When everything was over, I looked at things that I took, which I consider the most important. They were, this warm thing that you put on a kettle to put it warm, and a children's plastic car. Who will tell me what was
George
going on
would
in my
take the
head?
dog, wouldn't you? You wouldn't take the painting and you wouldn't take the person, you'd take the dog.
We cannot talk about it. It's a distorted state of mind. So you cannot discuss even these things theoretically. Even theoretically. Because when the fire happens...
how does this relate to the subject of consolation for... I don't understand the...
I would have thought the correct answer is that these things can't be measured against each other. Proust novel is a great work of art, which we couldn't ever improve. It is a gift in itself to the human spirit. And it also shows, for those of us who understand it, perhaps one avenue to a kind of consolation, or at least a way of living with oneself. Then, of course, there are these experiments in political thinking, which can perhaps also do many good things for the people who are subject to them. But we know that in that area, we don't have the example of the perfect thing which cannot be improved. We know that here we're meddling with human life in the raw, and the attempts to improve it have more often made it worse than it was before. So,
why do we think that?
Well, because
What's
of the sort of things
statistical analysis here?
Well, because of the sort of things that George is constantly and perhaps emphatically reminding us of, namely that the great crimes of the last century were themselves, on the whole, resulted from people's attempt to improve the human condition.
Well, but that doesn't show it more often happens than goes.
No, I'm not saying that. But the fact is that we know that in this area that we're imperfect. We cannot say, here at last we have perfection. Those who've said that, like Lenin or Hitler, have been spelt the worst of human destiny for the rest of us. And I think that you have to be very careful in that area, therefore, of thinking that you've got something intrinsically worthwhile.
Yeah, but I think it would be a big cop-out to say, well, we know we can so easily go wrong there, so we'll put our life into something else, which is
I agree,
we can easily achieve perfection.
If you were sincere about these gestures, then you would give up being a well-paid teacher in that wretched university where you are and corrupting the young, and you would go off to Africa and do the things that Volley would like to see you do with the money you have.
I think you've raised a serious question. I think each of us has to ask ourselves that question. But I think for me, the answer is that you can make a contribution in a number of different kinds of ways. And if you think that your physiology and so on isn't quite up to the life of an activist, then maybe you can hope to contribute something through writing and teaching. And one can, if one tries.
This is not being reduced to activism versus thought. No. On the other hand, some of the greatest European philosophers led eventually to the Holocaust. The racist philosophers, Gobineau and company, they led eventually to the diminution of sections of the human race, including Immanuel Kant. The racist content of a number of European philosophers led eventually to the chickens coming home to roost. In the Holocaust.
That's part of the reason why it's so important for thinkers
to
counter that, to spend time thinking and writing on the other side. Is at least you can at least counter bad thought. If you can't create any good thought, you can at least object again and again to things that are evil.
I feel like we're sitting here trying to answer the question of whether Einstein or Beethoven is more intelligent. And who wants to answer that question? No. But if we go back to his original question, is reviewing your life consoling? Being a scientist in the area of memory, I look to my science to say that I think the examined life is not consoling, but the exaggerated life is consoling. And what I would mean by that, and the evidence I would bring to bear on that, is that for what we consider healthy human beings, we do exaggerate our past. We remember that we gave more to charity, that we had kids that walked and talked at an earlier age, that we voted in elections that we didn't vote in, that our grades were better than they really were. So we must have a reason for having these sort of spontaneous shifts in our recollection to remember ourselves in more prestige-enhancing ways. Maybe that's consoling to us, rather than to remember.
For what are you seeking consolation?
To avoid depression.
Are these guilt feelings or responsibilities?
One question is why consolation and not forgiveness or mercy? Because the suggestion, if you asked for forgiveness, is that you've committed some bad acts and you want to come to terms with those. And I would agree with Germaine that maybe in the end you can't ever fully come to terms with them, especially when you think about being part of a species that's committed many bad acts. But you might at least ask for some mercy if you can possibly get some. But consolation suggests that the only problem is that there's pain and suffering, and not that there's evil. And I think that's one of the things that's troubling us about the question.
No, but
The only thing I want consolation for is the fact that I will not be here after, let's say, 10 or 15 years. That my life is ending. That's where I seek consolation for.
And there's many things. There's many things that you have in life that you have to explain. There's every day I look out at least to get personal, and see these things that I could have done, these things I could have been, this life I could have had that I don't. And I have to look back over that span of time and ask this question. Were those decisions that led to these consequences worth it? Worth giving up this, worth giving up that, worth having sacrificed this much and sacrificed that?
In fact, you disprove with yourself, with your own acts, and need consolation for that.
Yeah.
But is there...
Well, again, in some instances, looking back on it, you can say, here is this thing that is here today. For some, it'll be a child. I didn't become the musician I would have become because I stopped to have a family. Okay, so I'm not that musician, and I have to ask myself the question, why? What is this? Well, it's this family. Okay, fine. Does that console you? Does that answer it?
There is no consolation in that way, I think.
Okay.
Martha made a distinction about an hour ago between the case of the individual life and the case of human life as a whole. It seems to me you could restate it by saying there are many consolations for the thought of our individual deaths. We get those out of memories of our individual lives, having had our consciousness expanded by Proust at one point, for example. The question, is there consolation for human history, is an utterly different question, and that depends on hope for the human future. It doesn't depend on looking back over the human past. It's just another way of saying that the political issue and the personal issue don't seem, commensurable.
I'd like to go back to Leon Lederman's vision of the world. I mean, it seems to me that is enormously consoling that we have come out of the forest 4 million years ago, and we know something thanks to Jane Goodall about apes, and that's how we once were, more or less. And I'm just astonished at how well we've done. It's an amazing jump from even however much we love the apes. It's an amazing jump from them to us. And the fact that we've messed up shouldn't surprise anybody. The amazing thing is that we're still around and we're still, in fact, capable of improvement.
I think it might be useful for me to indicate what kind of shall we say, charge I got out of this combination. See, I assumed that whoever thought of this idea was a pessimist. Like many of us, I think, appear to be on this table, that this pessimist had sat down, just looked at the world, found it intolerable, found it totally, intolerable, anti-human, contrary to what that individual defined as humanity. And so that is the premise from which I began, then, that it sat down and said, well, what exactly, what is there to ameliorate my responses to my environment, to my very existence? And decided that, well, just those moments of recognition of beauty, of extraction of beauty from the real world, from the imaginary world, from the artistic world, from human conduct, just those moments have provided the soul consolation. And I thought that the quest was in pursuit of other human beings who maybe also found this moment, these moments of beauty, which served as a kind of tolerance, toleration mechanism for existence. In other words, it could easily have been, I thought, justice and consolation, empathy and consolation, cookery and consolation, painting and consolation. That's what I thought. But the premise from which I began was that somebody found this world totally intolerable, like many people do.
But we can put our own interpretation.
Consolation is a kind of good feeling, a status of the mind, what you like. Okay. But consolation is somehow in a time relationship with something else, which happened already, which was bad, and now is coming something which somehow is a correction of this mis-event. And I don't share this type of view, because if I would be asked what is the meaning of this moment, then I would say this moment itself and maybe the next one. So this continuity of the life which approves itself. And therefore, I don't believe neither that this life is such an intolerable, terrible scandal that we should be somewhere consoled for it. Because for the vast majority, this life is now not full of physical pain. Maybe they ate something, and maybe they slept, and maybe they can breathe. So the most elementary physical functions are working. And the suffering belongs to the life. We get the sufferings also as a present from our fate, and with the so-called beautiful moments, or with all the moments which can be beautiful even in the suffering, it's one package. And this package doesn't need the consolation, because it happens so. And it's not possible to have a correction for the life with all the crimes and happinesses which belong to it.
I have another kind of twist to put on this, and that's, you talk about consolation being for something that's happened in the past, to do with forgiveness or comfort or something like that. But in the work that I'm doing now with young people, in many countries, in many places, in apparently hopeless places like inner cities, like some parts of the developing world in huge poverty, children are living without hope, and children who are thinking in our developed world and who think about the pollution, the destruction of the environment, the cruelty, the war, the whole spectrum of how we have destroyed this planet. When I think how it was when I was born 66 years ago, and how it is now for my grandchildren who are small, and I think of what we've destroyed in that interim time, it is shocking. And when young children or, students start thinking this way, they tend to lose hope. They've told me so again and again and again. And so I see my role, which I'm doing my best to fulfill, as trying to go around and offer glimmerings of hope to young people by trying to get them to understand that we can change the course of the world. We can begin to slow down the destruction of the planet only if everyone realizes that they've got to take action themselves, that it's not just a problem that's somebody else's. We all take part in it. And to give little gleams of hope in hopeless places, to me seems something that's worth doing. And I'll give you one example. I mean, there are many, but one that I found fascinating. I went to Shanghai last year, and I was talking in a big girls' school. Now, okay, these weren't the most poverty-stricken Chinese girls, but they were Chinese girls, and they were living in a situation where it's pretty grim for them. And I talked to them about looking around. I said, look in the newspapers, listen to your television and your radio, talk to each other, think among yourselves of who you know and what you've seen and what you've heard that's positive, that's hopeful. And cut it out or write it out and stick it on your notice board. So they started to do this, apparently, and they quickly filled up their notice board. And these are things like polluted streams that they were beginning to clean up. They were things like people who are spending more concern for girl orphans, all these kinds of things. And it spilled off the notice board and it went across the wall of the classroom. And the next door classroom thought, hey, this is exciting. So they started it in their classroom. Now they have these long corridors, because you know how many thousands of kids are in these schools. And they're calling these the walls of hope. And Shanghai has now declared itself to be, the Roots and Shoots is the name of this children's program, Roots and Shoots City of Hope for 2000. I'm not quite sure yet what that means. I'm going to find out, but they're very, very active now in many of the girls' schools and now the boys' schools in Shanghai. So to be able to go and give hope, because if you don't have hope, you fall into apathy. And if you fall into apathy, if we all fall into apathy, then we have no business producing any more children. If you've lost hope and you get it back, then that's a kind of consolation. It's a soothing. It's like a mother stroking the fevered brow of her child.
We're admitting in this discussion that there are such terrible events, whether we're talking about slavery, we're talking about Holocaust, we're talking about Rwanda, we're talking about the fundamentalist violence in Algeria, whether we're talking about AIDS. It seems to me that each time we raise a negative issue of existence, we're implicitly admitting that there might be moments which are contrary. And I thought that maybe what the question was asking is, do we find such moments in beauty, however ephemeral?
When you're a child, you need consolation for the fact of your powerlessness. You don't have power. You're at the mercy of these other people, and this is a painful thing. When you're a young adult, you need consolation for your failures and perhaps in love or in your career. This is the human condition. And when you're old, it's usually loneliness. And there is something that calls out of every person who goes through these stages of life, calls out for something. And it's not to say that it's okay. It's not to say that you're forgiven. It's not to say that you made the right choices or wrong choices. It calls out for something that assuages it, helps it, and that's consolation. As to beauty, perhaps that's a condition that, or a thing that in part is why there is art. And one of the things that fascinates me about Lascaux is we don't have the problem there of a long cultural history that led to this. We can't see this as an artifact of Western European culture or African culture or any other such thing. This is at the beginning. And when we look at this, people do look at this, if you go to that exhibit, what you see is something that resonates from 20,000 years ago. And there was much of the same thing. And I suspect that it was painted to console, to say, look, there's this rest of life, there's this other part of it. Yes, this is part of your life, and you've failed in this, or you've had misery in this.
That's the purest projection.
Okay.
Can I say something about beauty? Because I think that beauty is the least important aspect of art. It is a collateral which is completely personal. It's one's personal taste to like this or that. That is free. That everybody's free to find something beautiful. The thing about artworks, and that doesn't go for normal artworks, great masterpieces, the middle of the road artworks, is that when somebody paints or writes or makes music or performs a dance or whatever he does or she does, is that at that particular moment this individual is capable of escaping reality and suggests that something can be changed from as it was before. And all great artworks, and even all middle-of-the-road artworks, do something, they make something that was not there before. And that's why I said before that art is unlike life. Art is a sublimation. Art is above life. It lifts above, and it suggests a point of looking out to the world, to human beings, to society, that contains the possibility that things change and may not be the same forever.
And exactly, the pain that you're feeling now or the dissatisfaction or unhappiness you're feeling now which is part of the condition. By looking at that art, you're transported out of that. You're seeing that there is this other
by looking
this world
at art,
beyond you that will change.
By looking at it, you forget your memories for a small moment. And you think of something else. And that's, if you can call that consoling or happiness or pleasure or whatever.
Well, I call that consoling.
You can.
You said two different things. You said you escape from reality, and you also said you think of change. Now, to me, those might well be in tension.
I'm not a philosopher.
If we want people to be consoled and taken out of reality, that's quite different from saying we want them to be able to think of how to change things. And sometimes escaping from reality is precisely what you don't want.
That's the artist. The artist is wanting change. The viewer is
the artist. The thing is even that I've once said. The artist has no imagination. The artist is something that has an incredible feeling, instinct. He has an experience about his life and her life and the world, and he or she can put together a story, a painting, which comes out of his muddling, putting together, trying again, effacing, trying again, and then what the artwork does is that it puts into motion our imagination. That's what it does.
But it gives you the feeling and the sort of knowledge then that when you look at the painting or when you hear the poem or when you hear the music, that feeling of, yes, that's it. Mm-hmm. It's like this.
Yeah, it realizes also something you probably didn't know but thought you knew or something like that.
In a strange sort of objective way, as if you see behind the curtains of reality, so to say.
Yeah, but that actually is, I actually want to echo something that Rudy said. How do we deal with the fact that art actually can do its work when it's cruel, absolutely intensifies the inconsolable nature of our condition, terrifies, horrifies, brings us face to face with things with which we'd really not civically edifying and not going to make us better. I think King Lear makes us better, except it illuminates some aspects of the monstrous quality of the human condition. But you wouldn't want not to have experienced King Lear because it may damage one's prospects for meliorist activism or something. You wouldn't want not to have done that. But how do we cope with art's power as kind of almost demonic engine, really? I don't know. I mean, it just always... I wouldn't want it not to happen for those conditions.
Shouldn't one mention here, Simon, the element of distance that art always introduces, even at its most explicitly bloody, like the Rembrandt blinding of Samson? It's creating some measure of reflective consciousness between you and the thing portrayed, which is very different from the realization of violence in a Tarantino film, still even further from the gladiatorial arena, so to speak. There are lots of grades here, but what is peculiar to art, even of a tragedy like King Lear, is that it is bearable, because in some deep sense it's been put in the realm of reflection rather than action. And only, of course, through also presenting wonderful images. And I think this is a mystery how this happens. I'm not trying to give a complete theory of art here, but this is one of the things that needs explanation.
I'm a bit puzzled as to why the discourse about beauty has become a discourse about art. Because they're different discourses, in fact. And we're not getting any further with the beauty business.
I listen here to all this logical and practical talk about art and so, but I'm an artist, I'm a painter, I paint my whole life. And what can I say? I sit, for instance, the last week, I bought flowers, very deep red flowers, and I look to it every day. And I wait till the inner light goes on. The inner light means the moment that I start to paint. If the inner light goes on in me, I start right away to paint. Everything is there, the paint, the canvas. And that is the start to paint. And I paint till the end, but there is no end. I live in a lawless world. We have no law. The end is a spiritual orgasm. You speak just all the time about orgasm, physical orgasm, but there is also a spiritual orgasm. En dat is het spiritual orgasme. The end of the painting. En dat is het. I am there and I am not there. If I paint. There's an in-between situation. I'm a servant. I paint as a servant. The paint. The canvas. And I just say that is the end of the painting. But the next day I come back to my studio and sit and wait again. Everybody can do that. Nobody has time today. Everybody have dates and have to go there and here and there. But everybody can sit and wait that the inner light goes on. That means the contact with the universe. The contact with it unspeakable. The mystique where we live in a planet that we don't know. We know nothing about the planet. We're very proud and say we know so much about it. We know nothing about it. The only thing is by sitting, waiting, we're all a part of the planet. I am the planet, you are the planet. Everybody is the planet. And we have the planet in our body. And if you wait that the inner lights goes on, then you can talk. Now I have the contact with the planet, with our surrounding, with all the planets. And that is my way of painting, you know. I paint very expressive, very instinctive. And I developed it very much in 60 years, or more than 60 years I paint. And that has nothing to do with logical or practical things. When you talk about it, you speak very much as a Western, practical, logical, philosophical people. And that is not, I have to say, that is not the real way. That's the wrong way. Everything you talk, all these people here, very clever, very handy, very routine. It's the wrong way. You have to sit and wait that the inner lights can go on in you, and then we can talk. Then we can speak. You speak about consolation, but I'm sure nobody knows about consolation. Think only by one word, consolation. Try to go in it. Go in a being, a human being. What is being? What is being in our planet? You talk only fast alle routine you speak. You have learned it in the school. But that is not, it's nice to be a teacher for kids. That has nothing to do with real life. It is not the real life of an artist. All the big artists sit in a lawless world and wait what goes in them and paint it out. That is what I want to say. So it's very short. I speak very short. You speak a whole afternoon. I speak maybe 5 minutes. You know, I paint it out. I paint it out for 60 years, from the morning till the evening. I'm in my studio. If I don't paint, I still paint. You know, it's not only to move your brush on the canvas. Okay, that is what I want to tell you.
It occurred to me, listening to the practicing painter, that this business of the inner light turning on, one thing that's shared with science as well. It's not the case that scientists really go in laboratories and just bang around using some logical method. There is some strange and mysterious process that goes on whereby discovery occurs. When we talk about art, it's not limited to painting or this. There is an art, or there's a kind of a beauty to science. The first exhibit over at the museum is a letter and a drawing from Ed Witten showing an equation. Now, to those who are into this kind of thing, he feels there's a beauty in that, and I suppose that these gentlemen here would be able to say it was beautiful or not, but to some it certainly is, and I'm sure that didn't come other than some kind of sitting and thinking and letting a light come on inside, and in a sense, I think that's why art has a larger language or a larger vocabulary than we're looking at it here. And what that separates it from many other kinds of human activities, it does have that notion of inspiration to it, a kind of quietude that leads to inspiration, an individuality that leads to inspiration. But there's nothing unique about painting in that sense, or the process you're describing is not at all unique to your business. I think at this little end of the table, I think each of us at one moment or other has had that thought sort of pop unbidden.
I was going to say, exactly. You're absolutely right. I was going to, it brings us back to the beginning of this whole meeting. Sex.
Okay.
Or at least
We
it
know
looks
this.
like it. No, your palm sweat, you...
Pure mathematics, sure road to orgasm.
Shh, quiet, please. There's children watching.
It doesn't seem like sex to me. The greatest moments are, well, a little bit in the design of the experiments, but then when the data are in and we sit around the computer and look at the plots and the hypothesis, we're getting close here. Well, can we find some way of conditionalizing? I mean, what if we just look at half of the subjects? What does it look like? And pretty soon out of this chaos comes like an answer to a question. And there's a story in the data, and it's extremely gratifying, but it's not like sex.
Well, they're different. They're different ways.
What happens if it's the wrong story?
Well, then we have to change the story.
No, we have to change the reality. If it's the wrong story, then it's reality that's wrong. It's never the story. That's an advantage we have in the science business.
No, but there's always a question that gets answered. I mean, sometimes it's just a mess, and you know start over or whatever. But there's a question, and there is the answer, even if it isn't exactly what we thought it was going to be to begin with.
I'm just interested to know who the first mathematician was to describe a solution as beautiful. I mean, is it known? I've always wondered.
See, I think in Greece you couldn't tell, because the word for beauty is also the word for nobility, fineness, moral goodness. So it's interesting. I think there is no concept of beauty in the ancient Greek world, not as such.
I don't know about mathematicians, but physicists discovered the beauty of mathematics, and in a sense, well, Einstein, Dirac, many were absolutely convinced by the beauty of the mathematics. That they were right.
But we forget, for example, Christopher Wren was professor of astronomy, and if he had to surrender every other skill he'd had, he would want to retain that of a mathematician. And it seems to me, reading very crudely what's left, admittedly in his legacy, thought of mathematics and beauty as completely interchangeable. In fact, mathematics really defined what beauty was for him. So I mean, I was wondering if it was older than that, or.
I'm sure it's much older.
The mathematical theories of beauty go back to Plato's Timaeus, and of course, which influenced the whole medieval conception of what beauty was. And the building of the Gothic cathedral came out of this sense that that one was transcribing into stone the music of the spheres.
And actually, when you look at science as it's done, it has a great deal to do with building a house. It's very largely hammering and clattering and a lot of talk. It's not a solitary activity.
But it has some of the same impact we've been speaking, I think. It has some of the same impact that we've been talking about with these other artistic acts. There's nothing quite like, and we always feel this pang of jealousy when this happens, but you open a paper and you see the solution. A solution to this world of problems that we've all been struggling with and battling, and it seems an endless confusion, and it seems impossible, and there it is. And you see this thing, and it's a solution. And there's no question that there's an aesthetic, a feeling, a chill, whatever you would like to call it, that you encounter on that moment. And as I say, usually jealousy as well.
May I ask you, have you ever clung to a formula? I have a good reason for asking this. I won't tell you why. Ever clung to, let's say, a mathematical formula, against all rationality, simply because it looks more aesthetic than another, that there is an aesthetic hold of that particular formula on you. And you, in spite of the fact that rationally and procedurally, it is wrong, somehow it's wrong. Have you ever clung to it, trying to prove it right, simply because of its aesthetic appeal?
None of us, but I think some of our colleagues will.
Since we're talking about beauty and consolation, we're talking about beauty being brief. Do we all agree? Because I don't. I think that when you see something really beautiful, like an orchid or whatever it happens to be, that the memory of that can come back to console even years later. I think that it comes into us and becomes part of us if we found it really beautiful and really moving. I don't think it ever goes away.
Surely we should think about the religious paradigm here, because it seems to me it's a matter of logic that you're consoled for something you've lost, and that is what consolation is. And there are some things that we have lost which we can put behind, the loss of which we can put behind us, but there are other things that we either have lost or are destined to lose, our life being the most important, which, as it were, define our condition. It defines our condition, that we're in that condition of loss, in that state of loss. And that, after all, is just the idea of being cast out from paradise, for which our religion, talking about Christianity, offers a consolation. The consolation is something which has to be renewed constantly. That's why things like religious services, the Mass, and sacred service occur again and again every week. This isn't a consolation which, once you've got it, that's it, it's finished. Because what it is doing is reconciling you to a permanent condition of loss, of being, as it were, only the reduced part of what you might be. And, of course, we're in a condition now of scepticism and unbelief, but this experience of coming back to something that restores you to a condition from which you are by nature fallen, that is something which is deep down in our civilization, and we perhaps need to renew it. And when we don't renew it through religious services, maybe we renew it through things like the concert hall and the theatre.
It seems to me that art, sports, the beauty of natural, orchids, birds, and so on, they provide consolation because they come up when we want to say it's not been all bad. It's always a reference to the past. When we say the future will be better, that's not consolation. That's hope. And it has nothing to do with being ephemeral. It's a project. If I could come back to God, it seems to me that in the old days, God was the name for the source of consolation and also for the source of hope. And in those days, we were able to bring these great moments, the ecstatic, orgasmic, whatnot moments that we look back on and say, well, it wasn't really so bad, together with our hopes for our descendants, our grandchildren, the future of the human race, and so on. That was what God did for us, to make the source of consolation and the source of hope identical. As the intellectuals, the mandarins, have become less religious, they've separated the source of hope, politics, from the source of consolation. Sports, beauty, the arts, grandchildren, orchids, whatnot. I don't think there's much point in trying to figure out within the realm of the consolatory the possible answers to the question, was it really as bad as all that? I'm not sure there's a point in trying to make any interesting distinction between natural beauty and artistic beauty, between mass culture and high culture, between any of these, between grandchildren and friendship on the one hand and the birds and the flowers on the other hand, because these will remain forever idiosyncratic. Everybody's answer to the question, was it really that bad? Or, wasn't there something good?
This is just a question of you, a question for information. Isn't the complaint has been that consolation is I think it was Martha said, too weak, really, annoyingly Prozac-like, bromide-like kind of weak thing to say about what I think is actually completely the wrong question to ask of beauty. I much prefer a question of whether beauty surprises than consoles. But we're worried about this kind of stroking business. But consolation's too weak for what the Mass does, which I always, as a lapsed Jewish whose business this really oughtn't to be, redemption is much. Is that not? Or is it? Do you think redemption and consolation are the same thing?
Well, in this case, consolation for this fallen state is redemption, presumably. Or
right,
this is
but that's
a step
much
on the way
stronger than
towards
consolation.
it. Yes, I agree. I agree that you can be consoled by something even when you're not yet redeemed by it.
Right. For the record,
as a convert from Christianity to Judaism, I guess what I liked about Judaism was the idea that no consolation, but getting out there in the world and acting. This is the world there is. This is the chance you get. So do something.
Thing is that God is something or someone. I don't know, something or someone. It doesn't matter. Both. Whatever you say about him or her is true, because otherwise it wouldn't be able to say it. If we are able to pronounce whatever, if we are able to make any judgment, if we are able to curse him or to praise him, it will still be true. That's by definition. God is what by definition cannot be offended. Because he allows us to do that. So it's up to us.
A lot of record of his offence, though.
Oh, well, some, yeah. But then we're talking about religion. I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about faith, rather. Or you can make it otherwise.
But when I
believe
raised
he
this,
exists, but I don't care about religion.
When I raised this, I didn't mean to raise the theological question about the existence or non-existence of God, but to remind people of the fact that consolation is not necessarily a once-off or ephemeral thing, but there is this idea of consolation as a repeated enactment, something that you go through and which perhaps requires ritual. And even non-believers perhaps do this. This ritual reaffirmation of one's membership of the tribe, so to speak. And that may be...
I'm fascinated as a sort of... Well, actually, I'm not an academic or a scientist. I'm not a creator of art, but I'm the only full-time practicing professional musician here, I think. And I sing a lot of sacred music. I sing a lot of performances of Handel's Messiah. It's a sort of big tradition in England. Mm-hmm. And some of the most profound performances of sacred music, particularly Messiah, because it's the most traditional oratorio in England, some of the most profound performances are not the ones where you've got the instruments that Handel would have heard and all the ornamentation that Handel would have liked and all the authentic stuff. It's the north of England, Philharmonic Hall, Liverpool, big orchestra, much too big for Handel, really, singing with quite a lot of vibrato, totally inauthentic. But you sing, I know that my Redeemer liveth, with sincerity. Faked sincerity, real belief. It doesn't really matter. And you are uplifting the whole audience, and you can feel it, and you can practically see it. And this is an audience of people who basically, at the end of the show, will say, well, that was a very nice dress you were wearing, and they criticise you on that. But while you're singing, they are lifted up, and they are inspired. And Handel, when he wrote the piece, he was congratulated by a chum on writing wonderful virtuosic music for famous singers of the day to sing. He said, I didn't write Messiah for that. I wrote it to make people better. And I do believe, even when I was coming from a position of complete, devout, signed-up atheism, I always did believe that for the 2.5 hours that a performance of Messiah runs, people, well, maybe they're better people. Nothing to do with consolation. I think they've been taken somewhere else.
Have you heard the soul-shattering magnificence of the crowd, the football crowd, singing at a cup final in Cardiff? Where, I'm being perfectly serious.
Yes, I'm listening to you seriously.
A lift of a power.
Yes.
Does it make them better? They go out and beat hell out of the people afterwards.
What are they singing?
Yeah, but Handel, they don't do that.
Excuse me.
George, what are they singing? They're Welsh, they just love to sing. But
they sing magnificent.
What are they singing?
Are you saying that no reader of Proust has ever also been a reader and a follower of Marquis de Sade?
On the contrary.
Yes.
On the contrary, good.
And could I also make the point that I didn't say the audience was singing. The audience is listening to me singing. And if they're very lucky and they're at a non-authentic, politically correct performance, they are allowed to stand up for the Hallelujah chorus. And they love it.
Yes. So they do it at cup final.
Yeah, but men of Harlech, please.
Oh,
this is the most important point. I think that, yes, this is not snobism or anything of the sort, but I cannot understand the equation of the mob at Wembley with the audience of... I have seen them I've studied their psychology as best
When
as
were
I
you
can.
last at a cup final? I'm serious.
And that includes in Nigeria when we play our enemies across the border. I cannot equate that when I go to listen to
Let me help
Catherine.
you.
No,
Let me help
I
you.
cannot accept.
Let me help you with this difficult equation. When we were talking before about the upliftingness of art and so on, God knows I spend about as much of my time gaping at portable paintings as anybody else of my class background and education, and I greatly enjoy it. But I'm often dreadfully aware that what I'm looking at are monuments to ego, and in their way, extraordinary feats of individualistic display. And late 20th century and early 21st century art is all about celebrity and personality. We only have to think of Damien Hirst and so forth. So what's overtaken our culture has overtaken that culture as well. And everybody who merchandises modern art knows that they're merchandising celebrity. And my way of explaining that has always been that the art form of the late 20th and early 21st century is actually merchandising. That is the activity. Now, when you come to talk about football, what are you actually talking about? I mean, you're talking about something which is an enormous mass phenomenon, which contains incredible amounts of intellectual energy, which commands vast amounts of money. Every single person watching it on television or sitting in the stadium is an expert on the game, can discuss it for hours. Remember Brecht saying what he wanted from a theatre audience was the same kind of intelligent detachment and passion that you can find in a sports crowd. And he knew nothing about 21st century football. It is the legitimate cultural expression in Britain. It finances itself. It doesn't need to plunder anybody. It doesn't need to lie and bullshit and grandstand. We have totally mediocre people running the arts establishment in England, and we have geniuses running football.
And the music's great. The music is great.
And the music is actually great, and the Mexican wave is one of the great performance arts of the late 20th, early 21st century. It's very important not to be snobbish about football, and we will not understand our own isolation within our own cultures as mandarins unless we understand how much hostility to what we represent is actually bound up in this cultural expression. In some ways, we have provoked it because of the way in which the art establishment has withdrawn unto itself, premiated itself, patted itself on the back, invited itself to cocktail parties. We became an onanistic elite, and football is our punishment.
But let's for a moment, a little modesty about our small brains. The best historical estimate is there were 10 people at Golgotha. We can accurately say there were 1,100 or so at the premiere of Hamlet. There were about 1,400 at the premiere of the Missa Solemnis. At the finale of the Copa Mundial, there were 2.5 billion. The human brain, now let me just make my point, cannot take in what that means. When Karl Marx says quantity leaps into absolute quality, he's of course completely right, asking how do you conceptualize, which meant that when Maradona was running towards the goal, and Maradona found that fantastic phrase when he was cheating, it is the hand of God, that crazily brilliant inspiration. And Maradona is a version of the word for the Virgin Mary, as is Madonna, of course. And Maradona, when he was running towards that goal, the heart rate acceleration of 2.5 billion people on the planet. No other such event has ever been imagined, has even been imagined. What does it mean when 2.5 billion hearts begin to accelerate? The comic side was the English Water Board issued a very polite statement, tried to avoid going to the toilet, to the loo, at the same moment at half-time. We can't handle it. Now, no Shakespeare, no Beethoven has ever had the loo system suspended for human emotion. Now, I don't know how to handle this. I don't know what sociological concept can handle a planetary emotion. No politics has ever had 2.5 billion people.
It has a very boring repercussion for my business. And the only way to validate yourself or get credibility...
I'm just trying to say...
Hang on, I've started now. I'm agreeing with you massively. the only way to validate yourself or gain real credibility with most people in public life in England nowadays, if you are an artist, a classical musician, especially because we are all nerds, or an intellectual, is to proclaim a love of sport. I don't actually, I go to the ballet. That's my sport, and I can't join in. I mean, our Prime Minister had it kept quiet that he went to see King Lear last year. But, you know, in case it ruined his image. That's what the 2.5 billion have done.
Yes.
I can't quite imagine.
But
seeing my job off.
The important point, surely, George, one important distinction is that from those 11 people at Golgotha, that an emotion has been passed down the centuries, increasing with every moment. So that across time, diachronically, the weight of emotion is enormous and also carrying on. Whereas that 2.5 billion, which confabulated about an ephemeral heartbeat, has gone forever. It means nothing. Sure, and this, although, okay, that's the difference between religion and sport, art comes somewhere between the two. That first performance of... I forget what you said. The Missa Solemnis. Yes, fine. There were only 1,400 hearts beating there, but I bet over the 200 years since, another, or 170 years since, there has been a billion or two, but it goes on vibrating. Once you've heard the Missa Solemnis, it's not just that experience goes on vibrating in you, it's that you can return to an object which is perfect in itself and encapsulates it within itself, the meaning of that experience. You can't return to that. You can on video return to that moment, but it doesn't gain anything from it, and it doesn't have anything in it apart from that moment.
And how do you calculate just how many billions of hearts have missed a beat on listening to a recording of a Handel, a Bach, a Beethoven? How do you record the number of hearts which have... How many people have refused to go to the toilet because the music is coming to a crescendo? We do not go into homes to actually watch people listening to this music. And we do not know how many copies of William Shakespeare have been sold, since the bard lived. And how do you quantify these things? That is why I think we have a right to continue to make these distinctions, even if everybody, goes mad for a single moment when Maradona... I happened to watch that in the Martinique, by the way.
See it again and again and again and again. There are television channels entirely devoted to football where every Maradona goal is shown at least once a week.
But I'm saying that let us calculate. In the same way, how do you, if you're going to quantify, how do you calculate how many people have listened to one recording of even a folk music? We're talking just now...
But why are you talking in these terms? You can't quantify the sort of attention that they give. You're going to turn the Beatles into the most important music ever written if you keep this up.
A few years ago, if you had said you came from Chicago, they would think that's the city of crime and disgusting poverty and so on. Now people all over the world think this is the city of Michael Jordan. Now, those kids have got a reason for pride and hope in themselves and their city, no matter whether it's low art, high art. No, you don't need to ask that question. They're going to be more ready now to listen to Duke Ellington, to listen to Billie Holiday, to open their minds to all these things because they're proud of being from the city of Michael Jordan. So what's wrong with that?
No, I never said I had anything against Michael Jordan.
No,
I just say
only football. Basketball's better.
I don't like his game anyway. But I've nothing against him. And he's a very rich man, and he's a role model. I agree with you. He's a role model. What has that to do with comparing that game with a work of art?
That
is the
game
question.
Can bring people into a kind of attention, which then they can get from there to somewhere else.
I think what people are talking about is what is being excited. That is what it is when you look at a painting or you hear music or read a poem or you go to a sporting event. What's being excited, what's being aroused, what's going on then is not the same thing. There is a qualitative difference, and I don't think this is a point.
I'm saying you can use one as the platform from which
But I would like to make a point about this because all of us stuffy academics are sitting here trying to show that we're really with it, we're really hip, we really care about the Knicks or whoever, we're really concerned about the Red Sox, because we know when we're licked, and we're licked in this case, and we have really got to turn around and understand what went on here. This is a default culture. And one of the reasons why it's there is that the culture that descended from what was always bourgeois patronage, in the sense that it was born with the city-states, that culture gradually became bankrupt in a sense. And when you talk about the prices you're talking about paintings being worth are the size of the GNP of most of the African states. That's what we're talking about. And that is clearly blasphemous. The thing about football is it gives all of these small economies a stake in the future. If they can just develop their artifice to that extent, they keep providing these geniuses, as they are called, these extraordinary phenomena, who pull out these amazing plays, which are not even in the rule book, which have never been predicted before, which are not part of the numbered play that goes on in, say, American football. We're actually looking at something here which we've got to understand. And it contains the two things. It contains this amazing beauty, that where people do things that ought to be impossible, and that they can see. This is, a good advertisement is one that you can watch 500 times and not be bored. They watch those goals 500 times and they are endlessly exhilarated by them. So that you have that thing there, but also the fact that they live in rundown, dead industrial cities, that they have really no hope, that they're not involved in any courageous enterprise, that there is no crusade, there is no war to fight, so that they make up pretend wars on the streets. Sure, it's hooliganism, but it's also some way of investing all of that surplus energy and fantasy that belongs to these people. I have been terrified by it on many occasions. I've been mobbed coming away from a football match and stuff because I'm on television and so forth. I'm as frightened of it as anybody else would be. I've been terrified in an underground station when I heard the fans coming down because I was going to end up on the live rail. But it is still something that I have got to understand. That's the aesthetics of where I'm coming from. Yep. In some ways, my interest in portable paintings is the purest nostalgia. And that's another reason why that's not consoling for me. So one of the things seeing as we are gathered here today, we Mandarins, I think it would be something we could take on board, because that, whatever that idea was that wound up Beauty and Consolation, that's a place where they're to be found, where there is something that is perceived by many people as the purest, most disinterested beauty, and which actually makes lives that are basically hopeless, nasty, brutish, and much too long into something transcendent. So, and I have a friend who is a cell biologist. He's working at the cutting edge of the proteins involved in things that are going to be very important to all of us. He's working on the proteins involved in Alzheimer's and Parkinsonism. And I said to him the other day, it was a little while ago now, how did you feel when Cambridge United was promoted? And he said, I was walking on air. The discovery of a new protein did not make him walk on air. But the promotion of Cambridge United, which is a very tawdry team, did.
But I was thinking of Wim's first question when we all sat down together. And I can't imitate any accent, but I can hear the voice from Newcastle. The voice from Newcastle says, of course football isn't a matter of life and death. It's a bloody sight more important than that. And that is, every child in Newcastle knows that quotation. And that's one possible answer to your, what is the meaning of what is life worth living? And I want to borrow your phrase, we've got to take it on board. That's all I wanted to suggest. And how are we going to use our categories, our classical categories of judgment and insight with phenomena of this kind?
I think this cause, we don't need to be this pessimistic about the idea of art and the masses and our elitism. What else is going on out there in that computer world? And I'm very impressed by this, and this is something I'm not a fan of. But there is a huge culture of people designing art and exchanging art of a strange and peculiar kind out there. And this is not something that's being done by any means exclusively within universities or any other such thing. This is stuff that people are creating on their own. Now they've reached the point where they're making films, but they're also making drawings and paintings, and there's an astounding amount of this sort of thing going on. So in a way, I say that the mass culture is bubbling up its own new art. We perhaps don't participate in it, but and much of it's going to be impressive, and it's going to change the shape of things. By and large, they are not playing computer games. They're doing something altogether different, in some ways altogether more dangerous, but also, in many ways, altogether more hopeful.
Like all people in this world.
Like
I mean, they have
organising
power.
the
When they're on the-
rights. Are you
when they're on-
talking about that? Because I think that is hopeful, I must say.
One thing that happens to them when they get on that thing is they have power. I mentioned this thing earlier about one of my thoughts on this business of consolation, we talked about it, is the thing that as a child, oftentimes you have the sense of powerlessness. You don't have power. Other people have power. They control your life. When they get on that machine and they get contacted into that net, they have power.
However, there is something that's really true, which I find very frightening, and that's that young people growing up today seem to get bored very quickly. They're so used to instant gratification. And the most perfect example came, I took a group of 4 students from England, 16 and 17, and they were picked out of their whole class. They came to Gombe National Park, this most exquisite place, one of the few places where you can be completely peaceful and where, if you so wish, beauty can console you. And I had them up on this peak which overlooks 2 valleys, and there they were. They'd never been to Africa. There wasn't a chimp visible, but there were baboons, there were monkeys leaping about in the trees, there were the butterflies and the birds, and even the little dung beetles rolling their balls of dung. I mean, surrounded by fascinating things. Their fares had been paid, and I suddenly noticed these 4 had disappeared. And I heard some sounds, and I went to look. They were sitting playing cards. And I mean, to me, that was so shocking. But these kids today, everything's got to be now. They've got virtual reality. They can't sit, they're not going to sit in front of one of these things like the cave journey we had back in there. They've got to click a button so that something happens quickly, and then they get bored in 5 seconds and they can click something else. And this is a very, very worrying thing. And if we're talking about beauty and consolation, I think maybe we need patience, interest, fascination, awe. We haven't mentioned the word awe. All these things are part and parcel of a set of values which I'm afraid, because I find that youngsters today are lacking. They're not coming into their education. The families are breaking up, and they seem to be changing in so many cases.
Well, when I was talking before, and I was saying that we have to carry part of the blame for the present state of affairs. And you and I would both do what we could within certain limits. I have made my little films about the flora of southwestern Western Australia, which is being decimated even as I sit here, and about the dieback of the Aboriginal communities in Utopia. And you and I would not waste this opportunity. But when you were talking then, this is an increasing nightmare that I have. I thought, would I have the right to ask Jane if she'd be prepared to set fire to herself by way of bringing to people's awareness what is going on? I think about Jan Palach. Do you remember, before the Velvet Revolution, the thing that galvanized the world and that made it impossible for Czechoslovakia to continue the way it was the suicide of a student, Jan Palach. Mm-hmm. And I sort of do deals with myself. I think, if they tell me I have ovarian cancer, then I'll do it. I'll do the Jan Palach. I'll burn myself and make sure that they know why I did it, and I'll do it in a very embarrassing place, just as Jan Palach did. People were asking me before why I said we are to blame, blah, 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 because it's a question of the perception of the alternatives. We're talking about the destruction forever of a part of the ecosphere, a very important part, we think, very rich. And we say we're doing what we can, but our perceptions of what we can do are reasonable. We're reasonable people. We would not set fire to ourselves. But the possibility is that without something unreasonable done on our part, this present erosion will simply continue.
Well,
That what's needed now is martyrdom, not discussion, but martyrdom.
I don't believe for 1 second that if I were to martyr myself by setting fire to myself, which I won't, that's not the kind of person I am. I don't think that would make that much difference. And maybe this is very egoistical of me to say, but I think I can make more difference by doing what I'm doing now. So I never would do that. You can ask me if you like, but I shall say no.
Well, I'd say no too, but I would say no too. I think it probably would be unreasonable, but the situation is also unreasonable.
Yeah, I know, but I'm using just about every second of my life to do what I think is the best thing for me to do. And unless somebody can prove to me that I could do something different that would be better.
Well, for example, in the example that you gave of the activities of the school children in Shanghai, nothing they do will stop Shanghai being the most polluted city in the world and becoming more polluted hourly.
Well, I don't know. I don't think that's true. That's a very pessimistic view. It's not true. Think how London used to be. Think how the Thames used to be. Think how, this is one of the things I'm collecting up, these stories, these amazing stories of the resilience of nature. If we give her a chance, a helping hand, species that were on the very brink of extinction, that when people care and they protect in the wild, like the peregrine falcon, like the bald eagle, like the Seika antelope deer in Taiwan, then there's the amazing story of the black robin in in the islands off New Zealand. They were down to 2 birds, 1 male, 1 female, breeding. It's like Adam and Eve. And they did this amazing, I won't go into it, they did this incredibly clever breeding program where they kept taking the eggs away and having them raised by other birds and then taking them back to the original parent because they're all tame like Galapagos. And the biologists were helping this original pair feed the babies. And they said it was just as though these 2 birds knew their role because she and her mate lived for 13 years instead of the normal 7. And there's actually a plaque to her on the Chatham Islands. There's now, I think it's 80 black robins divided into 5 different islands so that hopefully there's some genetic drift because of course they're genetically identical, but then so are cheetahs. So, there is hope. And I think the reason I was asked to start this program in China was because when I talked to the politicians there, I said, you have these horrible polluted cities. 9 of the 10 most polluted cities in the world are in China. But I said, I can remember London when people were talking about smogs, when they were wearing masks, when it was absolutely ghastly when you walked down the street and everything was black. It isn't like that anymore today. Los Angeles, look how much better that is. Not perfect, but look at the advances we're making in not using fossil fuels. The electric cars, not perfect, the fuel cells. I'm making it my business to find out these things because when people have hope, they start to make change. And so I don't agree. I absolutely don't agree. I think that what they're doing in Shanghai is perfect.
May I add something? Sometimes help comes from where you don't expect. For example, after the changes in Russia, when all the economy actually came to a stop and became ruined, and everyone said, this is a disaster, this is horrible, blah, blah, blah. But one good thing came out of it. The ecology became much, much better. Because for about 5 or 6 years, no factory was working. And so there was no pollution. The grass came back. So you never know. It's no need to set yourself on fire. Just stop working. And it will all come back.
This is something the Dutch need to learn. Because after all, you had the most beautiful landscape in Europe, the place where landscape painting began. And look at it now.
A lot of people have referred this afternoon to children and grandchildren. The words have been quite frequent. May I put you the question first put by Elie Wiesel? Elie asks us if reasonable analysis, expectation, historical thought makes likely, probable, plausible that there is another Holocaust coming or another Gulag or another Kolyma, would you have children? Elie Wiesel very carefully asked this question. What do parents who know about this other world or who have gone through it, what is the answer? I certainly don't know the answer, but everything we're talking about, of course, depends on whether we're moving into a period, euthanasia at one end, for example, the right to leave life freely, which I think is vitally important. The idea of life with tubes sticking in you just nauseates me, and of depending on others. We must have the right to say thank you, it's been very interesting, adieu. The other, whether there are human beings, certainly we hear of it in the Balkans, where the women who have been raped have not wanted those children, few have. That is complicated, I know. It is partly cultural, partly ritual, partly individual. No one can speak for another human being on this. But Elie's question is enormous, and it remains, certainly for the small ethnic history and minority I happen to belong to.
But what kind of question is this, George? I mean, if no one had children, then nothing would happen, either good or bad, and it would all be over. But on the other hand, these bad things are not inevitable, and who could stop it but our children? So,
of course one can stop it. One is a free human being. Elie decided, and there are others around him, many survivors, decided not to have children.
But he teaches, so he has loads of children in that sense. I mean, children are the people that you devote your effort towards, and your intellectual and moral and
Would you
emotional
put them
effort.
Into a world where there is a reasonable expectation that they are doomed?
Well, why does he go around giving lectures then? Why does he talk to people and try to change their mind? Why does he tell you this?
Well,
no, but I mean, look, he hasn't dropped out of the human race. So whether he has biological children or not, he has children all over the world. He's trying
no
to change the
importance
future.
whatever that it's he or somebody else who
No,
asks.
but I mean,
I'm asking
if he really thought things were completely hopeless, then why would he go around trying to change the world?
I'm not asking the question of having children is a gamble. Is a gamble on hope. Is a gamble on futurity. And there are those, just asking the question, who may think it's a real question, who may not take that gamble.
Surely the answer to your question, George, is a variation of what Martha has just said, that your children are precisely the ones who are going to make things better. The worst thing to do is to leave it to the children of those others who haven't even seen the possibility that you have seen. So you're under an obligation to have children once you've had this vision.
Aren't you glad about unplanned pregnancy? Otherwise, children would never have a chance. It's so terrific that they still insist on being born, whether we like it or not. Yes. It's hope, you see. Spring's eternal.
Error.
I can't really imagine that knowledge could lead to the end of hope, except in cases like knowing that the Romans would enslave your children, knowing some concrete prediction. Yes. But, could there be such a thing as religious or philosophical knowledge which was, strong enough to take away hope? I mean, surely our projects of knowledge are in the service of our hopes. You can't, as it were, use knowledge to trump hope.
What if hope is a matter of biochemistry?
Well, what then? Why not embrace it? But no, I want to get back to Kant. You wanted, and Kant, I think, was very good on this question, because he says even in a scientific and technical area, he says the fact that everyone thinks it will never be done doesn't mean at all that it won't ever be done. And he says, look at hydrostatic balloons, which is lovely, because you think, well, then they thought that couldn't be done. Well, look at what we have done. And then he says, in a moral area, it's all the more pressing that we don't give up this hope that just because world peace hasn't been achieved, that it might not be achieved. And in fact, we have an obligation to accept that hope and use the hope to motivate us to bring that about. I think that's true.
Surely there's nothing new about Wiesel's question. I mean, people have been asking that throughout recorded history. Nobody has ever come up with, an answer or even an intelligent discussion of the question.
It's a good thing that children have parents rather than the other way around.
There are communities which Macedine others. There are communities in Roman Spain, the famous case. There have been communities which killed their own children first to spare them from something much worse. There is much worse than death, and this has not been pronounced at all today. This business about the worse of life is perhaps a highly exaggerated notion.
Sure, if this programme went on for another 5 hours, that would be perhaps worse than death, wouldn't it? Or maybe 10 hours.
Yes, indeed.